What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back today with a video where we're going to be doing things a little differently. This is basically going to be a marathon endurance test where I'm going to tackle the best and the worst of 1999. And because it's the 25th anniversary of 1999, you're going to be seeing a lot of people doing essays and videos and podcasts about how it was a seminal watershed year that changed movies forever in both good ways and bad. And in a lot of ways, it was a watershed year in terms of the changing technology. Both big budget movies like The Matrix or low budget movies like Blair Witch Project were definitely benefiting from and exploiting all sorts of new technology in terms of how you shoot movies and how you tell your stories visually and that sort of thing. But it was also an interesting period from my own point of view because it represents kind of a pivot point in my own life, because the first half of 1999, I was still in college. I was a fourth year at UVA. For whatever reason, at UVA, we say first year, second year, third year instead of freshman, sophomore, junior, blah, blah, blah. But I was a fourth year at UVA. But for the second half of 1999, I was living in Los Angeles and working as an intern and looking for a job and going to job interviews and that sort of thing. And while I was still in Charlottesville, I was working at this kind of snobby video store called Sneak Reviews, where we organized our entire collection by the last name of the directors. But I was just absolutely awash in new releases, and I was at the movies all the time. I was running videos, but I was also completely, totally obsessed with film history at this time, almost to the point where I had complete contempt for the year in which I found myself, at least in terms of a lot of the trends when it came to like Miramax and MTV, because people talk about the 90s as like the great heyday of American independent movies. In a lot of ways it was, but it's more like the early mid-90s. And by the late 90s, what you see is this new trend where a lot of kind of the indie directors and a lot of the stars of these movies were being co-opted and kind of stolen by a lot of the larger studios, where they would have these movies where the posters and like the genre, they were trying to go for that independent flavor while slowly but surely kind of like easing into more mainstream terrain. And I just had this deep-seated loathing and hatred for so many of these actors and so much of the music that was being featured in these kinds of movies. On the other hand, though, there were a lot of kick-ass flicks that came out in 1999. I mean, any year where you have movies by Stanley Kubrick, Martin Scorsese, David Lynch, David Fincher, Michael Mann, Woody Allen, David Cronenberg, Trey Parker, Matt Stone, the Wachowskis, Steven Soderbergh, Clint Eastwood, Robert Altman, Sam Raimi, Errol Morris, Sidney Lumet, John McTiernan, Norman Jewison. I mean, the list goes on and on. Pedro Almodovar. I mean, we were just getting inundated with so many movies by so many filmmakers from different generations, because you still had a lot of filmmakers who were active, who had started their careers in the 50s and 60s, but you also had this new generation of filmmakers like Spike Jonze, who'd made all these kick-ass music videos and skateboard videos and that sort of thing. There was just a lot going on. And I think for people who didn't follow movies in 1999 or were born after the fact, I think what will come as the biggest surprise for them is just the variety. There's so many different genres that were still healthy and strong and thriving. I mean, if you just look at comedies in 1999, not only are there a lot of good comedies, but different kinds of comedies, like fake documentary comedies or weird like Gen X kind of cynical comedies, or just full-blown chick flick, rom-com, sentimental date movie comedies. No matter what kind of comedies you're into, the 90s absolutely had you covered.
That was wicked, man.
And I know in 2024, many people resent the term chick flick, but in the late 90s, everybody used the expression chick flick. Even girls talking about movies that they love would talk about chick flicks. Brittany Murphy, who's in like 6 movies from this year, would talk about chick flicks with love and affection.
I like to rent happy movies and have a happy time. Relaxing, romantic comedies, chick flicks.
So if you object to that term, well then you clearly weren't watching chick flicks in 1999. And if you liked chick flicks at the time, the good news was there were about 50 of them that came out in 1999. So that segment of the audience was very well served. If there's a recurring theme, or I guess a recurring trend in 1999, it's market segmentation, where you've got a wide range of movies being made at a much smaller budget, trying to satisfy different tastes and sensibilities. And I think it's a trend that Hollywood should get back to. Stop trying to make blockbusters that appeal to everybody and make these little kind of mini films that will appeal to one segment very intensely.
Doesn't she talk?
Her translator is broken.
Okie dokie.
And it's funny, as I was revisiting some of these movies, getting prepared for this video, my initial plan was, let's just do the top 10 movies in 1999 and basically regurgitate all the same points that we've been hearing since 1999 about what a watershed year it was. But as I started watching some of the movies that I hadn't seen, like movies I'd been deliberately avoiding for a quarter century, I started to realize, you know what? In a lot of ways, 1999 was also one of the worst years for movies, because in spite of the fact there were like 10 to 20 really cool movies that we can discuss, there were like dozens, if not hundreds of movies where like, oh my God, like maybe Hollywood should just, call it a day and just stop making movies altogether, because some of these movies are absolutely unwatchable. And I had to bail on a few, but I found myself immediately back in my shoes, age 22, age 23. I turned 23 this summer, 1999, where just like when you're that young, you have like a lot of very passionate opinions. Of course, every 22-year-old out there thinks that they're completely infallible and that their first instinct in every song or book or movie is automatically right, and that everything worth knowing about the movies they probably already know. And that's precisely how I felt at that time. But it's funny how if you start watching some kind of cheesy movies that you were deliberately avoiding at that time, you can very quickly find yourself back in those familiar grooves or back in that headspace. So a lot of my opinions on these movies I'm going to be discussing in this video, I haven't revisited these films in 25 years, so we're going to be relying upon the memories of a kid who was basically eating pot and smoking pot for breakfast. I mean, I was a complete and total biscuit head. How I got from point A to point B on any given day is a minor miracle. However, I was watching so many goddamn movies at this time, it'll make your head spin, because even though I was watching a lot of new releases, I think I saw somewhere around like 50 to 60 new releases that year, and I've seen many since then. But I was also just religiously and obsessively studying the movies of the past, where, I mean, I cannot overemphasize just how many documentaries about film history I was watching and just how many classic flicks I was watching on a regular basis. But let's do a little house cleaning. The rules for making this list is that you have to have had a U.S. release date between January and December of 1999. There are a lot of movies like Rushmore, which came out technically in December 1998. I didn't see it until deep into the spring of 1999 because I was living in Charlottesville, Virginia, and a lot of times independent movies wouldn't necessarily get to my local Regal or my local independent theater like Vinegar Hill until much later. But in order to make this list, just to keep it, more or less organized, if your festival date was in 1999, but your U.S. release date was in 2000, a movie like Jim Jarmusch's Ghost Dog, well, then that's a 2000 movie, even if some people did see it in 1999 at film festivals. And I've done my best to double check all the release dates on a couple different sites. There may be a few mistakes on my part, and there very well might be a few movies that slipped through the cracks. I think I've got opinions, at least, at this point, maybe on like 75 or 80 of these movies, and sometimes my opinion just going to be one sentence, and I'm aware of or at least seen the trailers for many more. And so, like I said before, this is going to be more or less a marathon endurance test, because I don't know if I can offer my opinion on 100 different movies, still keep my voice. And I don't know if it's going to take me 30 minutes to do this video or 90 minutes, but I've got a full cup of coffee, which is my second. So in theory, I should have enough energy to power through this fucker. But if I overlook some kick-ass, obscure indie classic, definitely let me know. But movies that I'm definitely going to be deliberately leaving off of this list are those movies that were made for TV movies. And I know nowadays people look at TV in a completely different light, where they're like, TV is my god, blah, blah, blah. In the late 90s, we were just getting into that Sopranos era where people started to look at TV in a much more favorable light, but made-for-TV movies in the late 90s were still considered total pieces of shit, and there are obviously exceptions to every generality, but I'm not going to be including made-for-TV movies on this list. But if I were to leave you with one key takeaway about this list before I dive into the movies of January 1999, it would be avoid getting overly nostalgic about different periods from your youth, because usually any era where you're 22 or 23 years old, everybody's going to look at it through rose-colored glasses, say the music rocked, the movies rocked, the books rocked, the girls were prettier, politics were more interesting, like sports were more satisfying. Everybody lives under the illusion just because they felt good because they're young and were energetic and were optimistic about life, that automatically means that everything was amazing at that time. But I watched a good number of movies that I had never seen before prior to making this video, which completely dispelled any nostalgia I might have for this period. If anything, I think my hatred and bile and bitterness towards a certain type of movie might be more intense than ever because I'm coupling my cynicism with the bitterness of age. But not to worry. When I get to the movies that I like from this period, and there are quite a few, I'm going to shower them with praise, so not to worry. This is the best of and the worst of 1999. So let's stop fucking about and just dive right into January. And the first movie that I have on my to-do list is a movie I'd never seen before. I watched it for this video, but we have Varsity Blues from January 15th. Now, I skipped the shit out of Varsity Blues at that time because as a college kid and as a high school kid, and still more or less as an adult, I just was not into football at all. And I grew up in an environment where everybody loves football. My high school and my college were completely consumed by college football. And just for whatever reason, I've just never been on that wavelength. But I do enjoy seeing the occasional movie about football, whether that's college or high school or professional. I mean, movies like North Dallas 40 are pretty goddamn entertaining. And Varsity Blues, while the Texas accents kind of come and go depending upon which actor might be speaking, there is no denying the kind of the pure, raw entertainment value of this flick. I mean, at a bare minimum, it has some of those beautiful women that you've ever seen. I mean, Amy Smart and Ollie Larder. Oh my God, when Ollie Larder shows up in that goddamn whipped cream bikini to try to seduce, was it James Vanderbeek? Yeah, James Vanderbeek. I mean, Jesus fucking Christ. And you've also got like a very young Jesse Plemons in here saying, he's chicken! And like, it is just a who's who of young acting talent at that time. Or James Caan's son, Scott Caan, stealing a cop car and driving around with a bunch of naked ladies because he's thrown all their clothes out the window. It is just an absolutely wild movie. And while a lot of the movies from this period employ songs that I absolutely despise, this movie does a little bit better on that front. It's got songs like My Hero by the Foo Fighters, which I think some people will enjoy. And you've also got Paul Walker in here. I mean, Paul Walker, definitely R.I.P., gone too soon, but he's in like 10 of these movies from 1999, but if you want to see Paul Walker when he was young and beautiful, Varsity Blues is your flick. If I were to try and sell people on why they should hunt down Varsity Blues, it's because it actually captures the way young men like to raise holy hell, whether they're in high school or college, and no scene exemplifies that more than when they go to the local strip club called the Landing Strip, where their sex ed teacher, Miss Davis, is performing for them to Van Halen's I've Got It Bad for Teacher, and it's just so inappropriate on so many levels, seeing high school students afterwards flirting with their teacher, and it's one of those kind of shock and awe pop culture moments which I thoroughly enjoyed. And it's the first key bit of evidence in this video that at age 22, I did not, in fact, know everything in spite of my feelings at that time. But moving on to January 22nd, we have Gloria, Sidney Lumet remaking the John Cassavetes film from 1980. I've not seen this movie. I love and adore Sidney Lumet. I mean, he's one of the great masters. I mean, if you look at movies like 12 Angry Men or Dog Day Afternoon or Network, I mean, these are some of the best movies ever made in any era. And it just seemed weird for him to be remaking a film by one of his peers from only 19 years prior. So I skipped it. Your mileage may vary, but I would just recommend people go back and watch the original John Cassavetes film. But on January 29th, we have our first movie, which is going to be a bit of a kind of a pop culture Rorschach test for how you feel about the late 90s. And if you can watch the scene from She's All That, where the song Kiss Me by Sixpence None the Richer kicks in, as the kind of like the nerdy chick emerges as a fully fledged hot chick. I mean, this is a remake or a kind of a reimagining of the George Bernard Shaw play Pygmalion, which George Cukor did as a musical, My Fair Lady, back in 1964. This is a story that people keep coming back to, and modern day adaptations of literary classics is definitely a running theme throughout 1999, whether they're talking about this or 10 Things I Hate About You or Cruel Intentions. But if you can watch this scene where like a young Kieran Culkin is kind of looking up and smiling, and Anna Paquin's looking all proud, and Freddie Prinze Jr. sitting there with all of his gross, disgusting hair product, if you feel loathing and disgust, well, then you are a kind of a Gen X cynical bastard. And if your heart melts and you're just consumed with joy, well, then I don't know how you describe those people. I was not one of those people in the late 90s. I skipped She's All That at that time because I hated Freddie Prinze Jr. Once again, any guy who was attractive in the late 90s who wore a lot of hair product, I just had a default position of hating their guts to the core of my soul. And there are going to be a lot of young actors discussed in this video who fit that description, where they would appear in a movie like Scream or some Kevin Smith movie or whatever the case might be, where they would suddenly get hot and they would get overbooked. And suddenly you'd see them in like 4 to 10 movies a year. And like, wait a second, how much of Skeet Ulrich do I need in my life? And I felt the same way about Freddie Prinze Jr., where after I Know What You Did Last Summer, suddenly he was just in everything, and he might be in 2 movies this year. I can't remember. He's either in, well, anyway, he's in She's All That Is Enough, and I feel the same way about Freddie Prinze Jr. now as I did then. But Rachel Lee Cook, I mean, there's no denying that she is a very pretty girl, very easy on the eyes, but I think she's probably just as boring as Freddie Prinze Jr. is. If you're going to watch this movie, watch it because it's yet another Paul Walker movie. Watch it for the young Kieran Culkin. Watch it for the young Anna Paquin. Like, the supporting cast is fantastic, but the movie is just idiotic and cheesy, and you get a little cameo by Freddie Prinze Jr.'s future wife, Sarah Michelle Gellar, but more on her in some later movies. But in the end, this is one of those movies that's kind of the poster child for everything that I hated about late 90s Hollywood at that time. But I will admit, watching it for the first time as a mean old man, it does more or less stick the landing. So I understand why people find it to be so satisfying, but my taste in 90s comedies, well, we'll get to some of those in the not-so-distant future because there's some good ones on this list. But let's move into February. February 5th, where the only movie I have on my calendar is Payback. Brian Helgeland getting sloppy seconds from John Boorman because this is yet another adaptation of the book The Hunter by Donald Westlake, which had famously been adapted as Point Blank with Lee Marvin in the late 60s. If you want to see a kick-ass movie based on this book, watch Point Blank. It's one of the coolest, most moody thrillers and action movies of the late 60s. But I paid to see Payback in the theater. I was a huge fan of Mel Gibson at this time. I mean, I grew up watching movies like Lethal Weapon, and obviously movies like Braveheart made him one of the biggest stars in the world. So I was not about to miss an action flick by the guy who had written the screenplay adaptation of L.A. Confidential only a year or two earlier. Like, Brian Helgeland went to work with Curtis Hanson on L.A. Confidential, and I thought more or less he kind of nailed it. Where's my copy of L.A. Confidential? There it is. It's over there. Love that book. But I guess that was 1997. So then after that movie made a huge impression, he got a chance to write and direct a movie. Payback was that movie. I think it more or less is kind of a forgettable movie, but I enjoyed it at the time. But moving on to February 12th, we have a live-action Disney movie, My Favorite Martian, which I skipped like a motherfucker. Disney in the late 90s was just as lame, but it was lame for different reasons. But at this time, their traditional animation studio was starting to disintegrate. In the early 90s, they had all their big classics like Beauty and the Beast and The Lion King. But by the late 90s, Disney was starting to run out of gas, apart from the occasional Pixar movie. But their live-action movies in the late 90s were just awful. But there's one major exception to that rule later on in the video, which I think will surprise pretty much anybody who is a fan of kind of controversial cinema. In any event, if I'm sleeping on some neglected classic, let me know. But on February 19th, we got a full-blown comedy classic, and I think it's one of the best movies on this list. We have Office Space.
What would you say you do here? Well, look, I already told you.
And Jesus fucking Christ, I didn't see this until I think about 2002 or 3. I have no idea why I missed it in the theater when it came out. I was the perfect target audience. I was still in school. Like, the fact that I overlooked this at that time once again proves I was not infallible as a moviegoer in February of 1999, but goddamn, I think I've seen it 10 times, 20 times since then. This is one of the all-time great comedies. Mike Judge, Jesus fucking Christ. Like, he knows this world whereof he speaks, and there's so much authenticity to the way he's portraying people. All you have to do is just kind of crank things up just a little bit, and you enter into truly divine comedic territory.
Ooh, yeah. I'm gonna have to go ahead and sort of disagree with you there. Yeah.
And now that I think of it, I probably could have done a pretty goddamn good top 10 comedies just from 1999 and actually not really had to struggle that much to find 10 contenders for the list. So Office Space, if you've never seen it, do yourself a favor and hunt it down. But on the same weekend, we also have Jawbreaker, which I did not see. Apparently it's just a ripoff of Heathers. I love Heathers. I've seen Heathers many times, but I don't feel like I need to see a ripoff or a copycat film. And we also have October Sky from director Joe Johnston. Joe Johnston, he's the director of The Rocketeer and would later on do Captain America, The First Avenger. I saw October Sky on DVD the following year, maybe like in the lead up to the Oscars in 2000, because obviously the Oscars in 2000 are all about the movies from 1999. I guess I remember October Sky being inoffensive and charming and kind of wholesome, but I don't really have any real kind of lingering, strong impressions of it. But for the last weekend in February 26th, we have some healthy competition with 3 different movies, all of which I skipped at the time, but I've now I've seen 2 of them, and one of which I will never see. But let's start with the easy one, 200 Cigarettes. I'd actually read the screenplay at Out of the Blue Entertainment, I think summer 1998, when I was working as an intern there. And part of your responsibilities as an intern, just to keep you busy and like away out of everybody's hair, they just give you stacks upon stacks of screenplays to read so that you know what's in circulation, what's being developed, what's being produced, and that way you just kind of keep your finger on the pulse of the industry. And I'd enjoyed the screenplay for 200 Cigarettes, but I ended up catching it on DVD many years later. But we also have 8mm, which I just saw last night for the first time. Joel Schumacher, the previous, or I guess 2 years prior to this, had made Batman and Robin, and I'd made up my mind at that point never to see another movie by Joel Schumacher. And I more or less held to that vow for 25 years. And what's crazy is that Joel Schumacher had 2 movies come out in 1999, including his movie Flawless, which I also skipped. But 8mm, it was just as bland and boring as I feared. It's trying to be shocking and verboten and transgressive and take you into strange, forbidden territory. But if you're watching a movie about like snuff movies and kind of the dark web, it's hard to, I guess, make an impression on anybody after 25 years of constant presence on the internet. If you stay on the internet long enough, you're going to see some shocking stuff. And 8mm is about as shocking as like wheat toast with a cup of milk. But it's written by Andrew Kevin Walker, the writer of Seven. But if you're keen on watching a Nicolas Cage movie from 1999, I would steer you towards Bringing Out the Dead, which came out much later in the year, instead of watching 8mm, which just feels quaint at this point. But the big movie we have to talk about from this weekend is one where I've seen the trailer several times, and only in the late 90s could this movie exist in both, well, how can we even describe this movie? First, let's just tell people what I'm talking about. The Other Sister, from director Gary Marshall. And Gary Marshall is one of those directors where the types of movies he made, the flavor of comedies that he made, where they're trying to be kind of wholesome and inspirational while at the same time having a little bit of naughtiness to them. And it just felt like you were being served up stories told by like your least favorite substitute teacher. But in this movie, you've got Juliette Lewis and Giovanni Ribisi playing 2 young lovers who are slightly mentally handicapped, to put it mildly. That's the phrasing they use in this movie. Having not seen the movie, I'm sure they use a variety of terms that are out of fashion.
I want you to meet Daniel.
Don't worry, because I've been house trained.
But when I first saw the trailer, I could not believe that Hollywood was trying to sell us on the idea of like, this movie basically, it sums up or kind of captures all the misguided impulses of Hollywood, where they're trying to have a precocious, cute character who somehow is wise beyond her years, who is kind of spouting out meaningless platitudes about life and love, etc.
I need to be responsible so that my parents get off my back.
But there's so much about the delivery of the dialogue in this movie, which would obviously be very provocative to people today for reasons that could never have been anticipated back in 1999. But I just find it hilarious that this movie exists, and that it exists with the best of intentions. But it makes me wonder, like, what would this movie have been like if it had been made by Trey Parker and Matt Stone instead of a nauseatingly sentimental director like Gary Marshall? And I think he actually has another movie he actually directed also Runaway Bride, which came out later in the year, which was a huge hit. So he had a bomb and a hit in the same year. But here's a little bit of pop culture trivia. Juliette Lewis was nominated for the Golden Raspberry Award for Worst Supporting Actress for her performance in this movie, but she lost to Denise Richards for The World Is Not Enough, which we'll be getting to much later in the video.
Are you here for a reason? Or are you just hoping for a glimmer? And you are?
But let's push ahead to the next week in March 5th, where we've got a ton of healthy competition. And let's start with Analyze This, where we got Harold Ramis back in the director's chair for another monster hit. And I grew up watching movies both starring Harold Ramis, written by and directed by. I mean, movies like Caddyshack. I have no idea how many times I've seen Caddyshack, but I went through a big period of my life where my friends and I could talk for 20, 30 minutes with nothing but Caddyshack quotes. And that was considered the peak of wit and sophistication. But goddamn, this guy just had comedy in his bones, and he died way too young. And when Harold Ramis died prematurely, I feel like the entire comedy genre in movies contracted visibly overnight. And analyze this, I would never claim that it's one of his best movies, but there's no denying it was a huge, huge, huge money earner, and it launched a sequel. So if you like Harold Ramis comedies, definitely check out Analyze This. But we also had the U.S. release of Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. It had come out in the U.K. in 1998, but here in the U.S. in 1999, we finally got up to speed with Guy Ritchie. And while I think Snatch is pretty much superior in every way, it was a big debate after Snatch came out. Like, which do you like better, Lock, Stock, or Snatch? And people would show it as a double feature in revival houses like the New Beverly. It's well worth hunting down. I mean, there's so much acting talent that would go on to bigger and better things in the years to come, including producer Matthew Vaughn, who got to start working alongside Guy Ritchie before going off in his own direction. And I think ultimately, Matthew Vaughn has eclipsed Guy Ritchie as the more interesting filmmaker. But once again, you can't get to Snatch without Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, so there it was. But also on March 5th, we had a nice, kinky little movie written and directed by Roger Kumble, based on Dangerous Liaisons. I mentioned before how we had all these modern-day adaptations of literary classics, but I skipped Cruel Intentions at that time. I foolishly at the time believed it was going to be yet another movie like She's All That, where you've got all these hot young actors just babbling meaningless, vapid nonsense. And some of my suspicions were on point at that time. However, Sarah Michelle Gellar and Selma Blair are so fucking funny in this that I think this movie is actually required viewing.
Okay, let's try it again. Only this time, I'm gonna stick my tongue in your mouth. And when I do that, I want you to massage my tongue with yours. And that's what first base is.
And it's funny how talking about this movie can take me back to a time where actors like Ryan Philippe or Philippe, I've never actually learned how to pronounce his last name properly, he and Justin Timberlake, like NSYNC was huge at this time, but they both kind of represented the exact same curly-haired pretty boy that my sisters adored, but because of like the like undying admiration and lust of young girls for these kinds of guys at that time, I just wanted Ryan Philippe to be dunked in acid and like slowly in the most painful way humanly possible. I just fucking hated him. However, having now seen the movie as a bitter old man, he's pretty fucking funny in this. I mean, his little lines like, how are things down under, blossoming my hope? I mean, some kind of filthy, dirty, nasty stuff. And when you hear some of the terminology that kind of gets thrown around by some of the characters in this movie, I mean, admittedly, they're supposed to be capturing these kind of evil bastards in New York at this time instead of France. And I guess the original book was set like in the late 1700s or early 1800s. It's New York, 1999. But I can't even quote some of the naughty dialogue from this movie without running the risk of getting thrown off of YouTube. So if you want to know what I'm talking about, hunt down a deleted scene with Alicia Class, who actually gets topless in the deleted scene. But that it is available online, and that'll tell you all you need to know about the way that teens and early 20-somethings express themselves at this time. But whenever people are talking about Sarah Michelle Gellar, it's easy to talk about Buffy and nothing else. But I think Sarah Michelle Gellar is actually incredible in this. And just the way she's teasing her stepbrother with like a nearly exposed boob, or like kind of shoving her knee between his legs.
If I win, then that hot little car of yours, mine.
And if I win?
I'll give you something you've been obsessing about ever since our parents got married.
And just so brazenly offering her body to him if he wins their bet, saying things like, I'll fuck your brains out and you can put it anywhere. I mean, this is a movie about a stepbrother and a stepsister making a bet where one's going to win a car or the other's going to have a little incestuous action that they've been fantasizing about ever since their parents got married. And I just think it's hilarious that this was considered mainstream entertainment in 1999. I mean, this movie was a hit. But flash forward to 2024, this kind of subject matter really only gets explored on Pornhub. And also, I'm just now realizing that I've probably, because 2024 is so brand new, I'm probably going to make the mistake of referring to the present year as 2023 instead of 2024 very frequently. So this is my one apology that applies to the entire video. 2024 is the year in which we live, but I'm just going to naturally say 2023 because I'm an idiot, but let's push on to March 12th. We have a couple movies which I've been avoiding my entire life. So we've got Wing Commander, which I skipped. I was so tired of Matthew Lillard and Freddie Prinze Jr. at this point. I was not about to go see this fucking movie. And I remember seeing the trailer and just thinking, like, there's nothing about the movie that appeals to me, because while I liked Matthew Lillard in Scream back in, 1995 or 96, by this point, he was just so overexposed. And I think at this point, my loathing for Freddie Prinze Jr. at this time is well documented, but I just wasn't about to go see it. But we also have The Rage, Carrie 2. It's funny, you would have thought it would be Carrie 2, The Rage, but it was The Rage, Carrie 2. I will never see it. Brian De Palma's Carrie is one of my all-time favorite horror movies. And I think there's a case to be made that Brian De Palma's Carrie is actually the more satisfying story than Stephen King's original novel. I read Stephen King's original novel. I was enthralled by it. But I think I've seen Brian De Palma's movie, I don't know, dozens of times. I mean, it's a fucking masterpiece. So yeah, I would not be seeing The Rage, Carrie 2. But we also had The Corruptor, where Chow Yun-fat paired up with Mark Wahlberg. Right around this time, we were getting this massive kind of influx of Hong Kong talent, and a lot of these experiments worked out great. I mean, John Woo came to Hollywood, started directing movies that worked out great. Jet Li came to Hollywood, started making movies that worked out great. Jackie Chan came to Hollywood, started making movies. Michelle Yeoh, Chow Yun-fat. Suddenly these actors and these directors were just everywhere. And maybe some Hollywood filmmakers learned the wrong lessons, where they started doing a lot of choreography that was meant to kind of imitate the style of Hong Kong directors like Yuen Woo-ping, who we'll be getting to in the not-so-distant future when we tackle The Matrix. But I guess for a brief shining moment, it was really cool that the best and brightest talent making movies in Hong Kong in the early 90s suddenly was in Hollywood, injecting a little more flavor. And so, yeah, you'll be seeing a lot of Chow Yun-fat in this year. But the movie I want to talk about from March 12th is a movie I've never seen, but from a director that I do admire, from director Bob Clark, who gave us Black Christmas, A Christmas Story, and Porky's. But we have Baby Geniuses. And this is a movie that will live in infamy for all time, because I think if there were ever a movie made by Hollywood that provides you with all the evidence that you need to know that as an institution, Hollywood should just cease to exist, it would be Baby Geniuses, where you're watching the trailer and like, oh my God, like, who made this? And how come they haven't been like locked away in perpetuity or hanged publicly by the President of the United States? I mean, this movie is a complete and total abomination, but clearly there was an audience for it. It got a fucking sequel.
Let's kick butt!
He's out.
But if I were to pick one movie from the late 90s that kind of represents like the perfect target for any sort of mean-spirited kind of Gen X sensibility, it would be a movie like Baby Geniuses. Gen Xers were put on this planet to oppose and mock and ridicule movies like this. And now that I've shown a few clips of this cultural oddity to you, I hope you'll join me in mocking this movie for all time, sight unseen. But on March 19th, we have Forces of Nature, a movie which I did see on video with one of my sisters back in the day. We have True Crime. This is Clint Eastwood's contribution to 1999. If you're going to watch movies directed by Clint Eastwood or starring Clint Eastwood, there are a lot of other movies that I would recommend first. This movie does feel a little slow in hindsight. However, the kind of like final 20 minutes are pretty tense, pretty exciting. And the first 20 minutes, we get to see Clint Eastwood at like age 69, basically trying to fuck everything that moves. So if your idea of a good time is watching somebody who needs fistfuls of Viagra to perform, definitely hunt down True Crime. But as far as his directorial efforts are concerned, I would steer people toward like Play Misty for me or Unforgiven. But at any rate, it is, at this time, Clint Eastwood was basically directing a movie every single fucking year, so this is what he did. And we also have Ravenous, which is a movie where I can remember making up my mind not to see at that time, because it felt like one of those movies where movies like LA Confidential and Trainspotting had been a success, so suddenly all those actors are being scooped up and dropped into what I thought at the time was going to be just some cheesy, disposable genre film, but in actuality, it's a pretty satisfying kind of hardcore punk rock cannibal movie. So if you like seeing violence and cannibalism and cool young actors out in the snow just beating the fuck out of each other, definitely hunt down Ravenous. I overlooked it at the time, and that's on me. I fucked up. I think Ravenous is definitely... This and Deep Blue Sea are probably the best cult classic genre films from this period, where They are unpretentious, low-budget genre films that have withstood the test of time. But we'll get to Deep Blue Sea later in the video. But let's move on in the calendar to the weekend of March 26th, where we have Ed TV by director Ron Howard. I did not see this at the time. I liked Ron Howard as a director throughout like the late 80s and early 90s, and I saw a lot of his movies. But for whatever reason, at this time, I just felt like Ed TV was a rental, as we used to say back when we would go to the video rental store pretty much multiple times a week. We also have the Mod Squad from March 26th, which I've never seen, never will see, and apparently even the people who tried to defend it at the time, even they acknowledge or concede that the movie is kind of unwatchable. But March 31st is a major weekend, and I guess let's start with 10 Things I Hate About You, which I skipped at the time, but I saw a couple days ago, and I will admit, it's got its moments. I think the whole movie is worth seeing just for the needle drop, where you've got a Notorious B.I.G. tune as Julia Stiles is hammered, dancing for the enjoyment of an entire party. And she just crushes that scene. But Heath Ledger, goddamn, this is 9 years before The Dark Knight. And, obviously he was, died sadly prematurely. I think he was like 28 or 29. But this is back when he was just a young Australian actor trying to make a name for himself. And I think he pretty much crushes the material that is given to him. And the material is actually an updating or a modern-day adaptation of The Taming of the Shrew by Shakespeare, a play which I must admit I've never read. I think I've read like 12 or 13 plays by Shakespeare. I don't know why I've never read The Taming of the Shrew, but this is the closest I've come. But this is one of those high school movies from the late 90s where as you're watching, you're like, oh my God, every single person in this movie went on to bigger and brighter things, including obviously Joseph Gordon-Levitt. I mean, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, he's almost unrecognizable in this. He's still like a fucking kid in this, but he is good. But I think with both Julia Stiles and Heath Ledger, they've got movie stars written all over them. And maybe Julia Stiles kind of like slowly but surely transitioned into more of a character actress as she got into her early 40s. But in 1999, she was definitely the next big thing. And contrary to most high school movies of this time, where most of the soundtrack features songs that just make me want to blow my goddamn brains out, this movie's actually got some cool tunes like Sexy Boy by Air. If you've never listened to Air from the late 90s, they had a bunch of good albums, but Sexy Boy, that is an absolute banger of a tune. But the other big movie, which came out the weekend of March 31st, had made its premiere on March 24th at the Mann Chinese Theater, but it went wide in the U.S. on March 31st, and my friends and I were there, and that is The Matrix. This is the, I think it's the fourth highest grossing film of 1999. And it was the highest grossing Warner Brothers movie of 1999. $63 million budget, grossed $460 million. Name the last time you saw an original science fiction movie based on an original screenplay, even if it's borrowing heavily from other kind of Hong Kong action films like Fist of Legend or cool cyberpunk animation like things like The Ghost in the Shell. But it was an original screenplay by two young up-and-coming filmmakers, the Wachowskis, whose prior credit, Bound, was cool, but had not been some crazy runaway success. Bound almost feels like it could be a little like kind of like corner of the Matrix universe because the aesthetic, the style, the clothing, just everything about the look and feel of Bound feels like it could be set in the world of the Matrix. But this was, to use a word I've already overused in this video, it was a watershed moment where you had this stylish as hell kind of film noir / cyberpunk movie that slowly but surely evolves into the most epic science fiction movie of this era. I mean, it's sexy as hell, it's stylish as hell, it's got Yuen Woo-ping choreography, which at that time for most American audience members was unlike anything that any of them had ever seen before. But even if you were already well versed with that kind of Hong Kong choreography, this was just a fucking cinematic orgasm of a movie that just fried people's brains. I mean, it took hold of our imagination the same way a great science fiction novel would, or any major science fiction classic in movies you care to mention, whether you want to talk about Metropolis or 2001 or Blade Runner. This is one of the seminal science fiction movies. It belongs on anybody's top 10 list of their favorite science fiction movies ever made. And every time I revisit it, I'm blown away all over again. From the moment I see the Warner Brothers logo and hear that soundtrack, just that green visual aesthetic combined with the unique sounds of this world, you're immediately in another universe. I wish they had never made Reloaded and Revolution or Resurrected or anyway, 2, 3, and 4. None of them really have any real staying power in my imagination, apart from like a few little brief shining moments. But The Matrix, goddamn, every time I watch it, I fall in love with it all over again, and it grows in my estimation every time I see it. So not only is it one of the best movies of 1999, I think it's one of the best movies of the 1990s. It's one of the best movies of the science fiction genre, and holy shit, it's one of many reasons why people talk about 1999 as a year where, in terms of technological innovation, we saw the movie industry take many leaps forward, and I think it's easily one of the most influential blockbusters of that era. But if I keep talking about The Matrix, we will never finish this video, so let's move on to the world of Robert Altman on April 2nd, Cookie's Fortune. I mean, no one's going to include Cookie's Fortune like in their top 5 or top 10 favorite Robert Altman movies, but at this time, my friends and I were Robert Altman freaks. We loved MASH, and we loved The Player, and we loved McCabe and Mrs. Miller, and we loved Nashville, and so I remember like 3 or 4 of us going to see Cookie's Fortune, and we laughed like hell. It's got a great cast. You got Julianne Moore and Glenn Close. You've even got Charles Dutton, who appears in multiple movies in 1999. You got Liv Tyler, Chris O'Donnell. I mean, it's a who's who of acting talent. Ned Beatty, Patricia Neal. Patricia Neal, she'd been a star since the late 50s, but I love this movie. Actually, I should say I really liked Cookie's Fortune. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I don't think I've seen it again, though, in 25 years, because anytime I want to watch a movie by Robert Altman, I tend or lean toward late 60s, early mid-70s. I feel like that's when he was really firing on all cylinders. But right around this time, he also made Gosford Park, so he still had a fastball when he needed it at this time, and I think Robert Altman, any movie from any era, is always worth revisiting. But on the same weekend, we also have A Walk on the Moon from Miramax. This is one of the star-studded Miramax movies, which felt like there seemed to be a new one every week. I skipped this one very deliberately. And The Out-of-Towners from April 2nd as well. I didn't skip this because I saw part of it on an airplane, and I was like, this is the dumbest fucking movie that I've ever seen. You know, I love Steve Martin. I love Goldie Hawn. I grew up watching their movies. Out-of-Towners was not for me at all. And neither was Never Been Kissed from April 9th. I mean, they call the movie Never Been Kissed, but it's never been watched as far as James Hancock is concerned. But it's funny, earlier I was mentioning how Brittany Murphy uses the term chick flicks in an affectionate way. I think it's precisely this movie she's talking about when she uses the line about how she loves chick flicks. But that same weekend, we also had Go, which I skipped initially, but I was wrong. Go is actually very entertaining. Doug Liman, he'd made a name for himself directing Swingers only a year or two prior. And Go's got its moments, and it's got a kick-ass cast, including Sarah Polley. This is before Sarah Polley had made the switch to being solely a director, where she was, you know, the sexy young star appearing in a bunch of these movies, but she had chops, and I can't remember why I felt compelled to go back and watch Go many years later. Maybe I just felt like I'd kind of missed a part of my childhood or like my young adulthood by missing it. But yeah, Go, very entertaining flick. I think if you're going to watch either Go or 200 Cigarettes, they both feel like they could be like outtakes from the other movie in terms of like the cast and the scenes that are being explored. But I think Go is the superior film of the two. But April 16th, we have a couple movies that I missed, but I want to call attention to them. Friends and Lovers is supposed to be one of the worst movies of this year. And it was obviously a low point for Robert Downey Jr.
Everybody's getting naked?
Yep.
Somebody could have lost an eye.
But anytime you look up a list of like top 10 worst movies of 1999, Friends and Lovers pops up. However, sometimes people react to comedies in strange ways. I should see it for myself and form my own opinion. But speaking of comedies, we also have Life, which features Eddie Murphy and Martin Lawrence. Martin Lawrence actually has a couple movies from this year, also including Blue Streak. I had totally forgotten that Martin Lawrence and Eddie Murphy actually did team up for a comedy at one point, directed by Ted Demme, who had made a big name for himself with The Ref. But I've not seen Life. I don't know if it's a neglected comedy classic or totally tedious and boring. You tell me. And then we also have a movie written and directed by David Mamet, which for whatever reason I did not see. And at this time, I thought I was a giant David Mamet fanatic. Like, I loved House of Games. I really enjoyed The Spanish Prisoner, which had come out in the theater either 1 or 2 years before The Winslow Boy. I don't know why I didn't see The Winslow Boy. Maybe it just felt like kind of a stuffy adaptation of a stuffy British novel. And maybe it's like full of scathing wit and brilliant dialogue like so many other movies written by David Mamet. But one of these days, I will go back and check it out because I do eventually want to see every single movie directed by David Mamet because I do think he is one of our better storytellers from this period. But only a few days later, we had Existenz from director David Cronenberg, who is one of my all-time favorite directors. But Existenz is not one of my all-time favorite Cronenberg movies. If you wanted to talk sci-fi and Cronenberg, I lean much more towards Scanners and Videodrome or The Dead Zone, if you include that as sci-fi. I guess it's sci-fi, or maybe you could say it's supernatural. But in any case, David Cronenberg is no stranger to sci-fi. I mean, The Fly was the first Cronenberg movie that I ever saw, and I still think it's one of the best horror movies or best science fiction movies that I've ever seen. I like Existenz, but it feels a little bit like Cronenberg is trying to recapture the glory of Videodrome in an area where perhaps he doesn't have as much expertise, because this is about the world of video games. And I feel like Cronenberg knows wherever he speaks when it comes to the terrain being explored by Videodrome. It almost feels like that could have been his life if he hadn't been a successful filmmaker. Existenz feels like it's faking it a little bit when it comes to the world of video games. And I just don't buy Jennifer Jason Leigh or Jude Law in the characters, but I know there are people out there who really love this movie, really admire it, and so fair play. Go make your own video singing the praises of Existenz. I think Cronenberg's a fucking genius. I just don't include Existenz in his best movies. But on the weekend of April 23rd, we have some interesting ones to discuss, and one of them, Election, I do think is one of the best movies made by director Alexander Payne. I revisited it last night, and I was screaming with laughter for a variety of reasons. But first and foremost, Reese Witherspoon, who I forgot to even mention when I was discussing Cruel Intentions, but Reese Witherspoon is a fucking comedic genius in this movie. And I think between this and Freeway, we see a very different side of Reese Witherspoon than what we have seen in the years since. And these days, it's very easy to look at Reese Witherspoon as an actress where she definitely created a brand with movies like Legally Blonde or Sweet Home Alabama, where she made piles upon piles of money. She's probably amongst the biggest money earners of any actress who has also been producing her movies for an extended period of time. She has been extremely successful in all of her endeavors in this life. But I think her most interesting performances come in the late 90s. Freeway, she's divine, but since we're talking 1999, it's all about Election, and just seeing her say, "Fill me up," when Matthew Broderick is having strange fantasies while he's trying to impregnate his wife. He's thinking about his wife's best friend, but Reese Witherspoon's head keeps kind of sliding in and interfering with his ability to fill up his wife as she is commanding him to do. But I actually missed it in the theater. I caught it later in the year on DVD, but there were so many high school movies coming out at this time that they all kind of felt interchangeable. It's like, oh, this is yet another high school movie with a lot of attractive young actors, like hard pass, hard skip. But I was totally fucking wrong. And I remember when I was already living in LA, my younger sister Carter came to visit, and she was like, "Let's watch Election." I was like, "Election?" Then like one of those movies like She's All That? Dude, Election. If you want to see a comedy that kind of embraces the Gen X sensibility of the late 90s, Election is the poster child for the good comedies that came out at this time. And you really can't go wrong. But on the same weekend, we also had Lost and Found, starring David Spade and Sophie Marceau. I love Sophie Marceau, but I have not seen Lost and Found. Felt like yet another silly David Spade vehicle. And we also had Pushing 10. Angelina Jolie had not one, not two, but three movies in 1999. She had The Bone Collector with Denzel Washington. She had Pushing 10. And then she won an Oscar for Girl Interrupted. I'm going to save all my Angelina Jolie commentary for Girl Interrupted, which won't come until December of this year. But at the end of April, April 30th, we've got Entrapment with Sean Connery and Catherine Zeta-Jones. And I saw this fucker in the theater by myself. And I think the main reason I saw it is the same reason that a lot of people saw it. Because during the trailer, there was this amazing shot of Catherine Zeta-Jones sliding under a laser beam with her butt up in the air. And I think sometimes people forget just how fucking popular Catherine Zeta-Jones was in the late 90s. Like between Zorro and this and Traffic and a couple other movies and her relationship with Michael Douglas, suddenly Catherine Zeta-Jones was fucking huge. And obviously Sean Connery, living legend. And I feel like by 1999, he was starting to lose interest in the movie biz, and he started turning down roles where he should have said yes. Like he turned down the role of fucking Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings, directed by Peter Jackson, and obviously Ian McKellen probably did a better job than Sean Connery ever could. But they went to Sean Connery first, and he passed, and he felt so stupid for passing on that. He ended up taking the wrong role in the wrong movie, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, a movie which is a complete and total abomination relative to the comic that it's based on. But If you want to see an aging Sean Connery still doing yet another action movie, for whatever reason, my stepdad just latched onto this movie and kept quoting it. The line, "If I'm late, it's because I'm dead," or something to that effect. But he just thought that was so hilarious. And so he'd use it for years on the phone. "Slim, if I'm late to dinner, it's because I'm dead." Ha ha! And he started cracking. I'm like, all right, like Entrapment wasn't that good, but I'm glad you liked it. And May 7th, we have another movie which I don't think was actually that good, but it was wildly popular at the time and launched a sequel. But we have The Mummy, starring Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. It was going for that Raiders of the Lost Ark vibe. But I remember at the time and now just thinking that the digital effects for this period were so clumsy and so gross. The movie instantly felt dated. Perhaps I'm being too harsh because this movie is an enjoyable romp. It's an enjoyable adventure movie. It's got a lot of action. It's got a lot of spectacle and thrills. But the digital effects of the late 90s have aged horribly. And I think a lot of digital effects age horribly, where the movies instantly feel dated after only a couple of years in ways where practical effects, maybe just because I grew up with the practical effects where I felt like they were real. Like maybe if I were 7 in 1999, the effects of The Mummy would have felt real in the same way that like the practical effects of a movie like American Werewolf in London felt real when I was 6, when I was watching it on HBO. But there are some people that really love the Mummy franchise. I just am not one of them. But if you want to see just a kick-ass special effects-driven action movie of this era, The Mummy is worth a look. But on May 14th, we have A Midsummer Night's Dream, which I can remember skipping because my junior year in high school, I played Snug the Joiner in A Midsummer Night's Dream in my high school production, where all I heard for months on end was people reciting this play poorly. And I love the play A Midsummer Night's Dream, but just if you've been in a play, a Shakespeare play, where you're around it or around the text all day, every day for several months, you kind of get your fill and you're ready to move on. And I felt the same way when this movie finally came out. But May 19th, we've come to one of the big topics of 1999 because we have Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace.
At last we will have revenge.
You have been well trained, my young apprentice. They will be no match for you.
Now I don't want to get completely derailed in this video discussing Star Wars and the culture war, because the culture war in Star Wars of 2024 is very different from the discussions surrounding this movie in 1999, which I think were largely dictated by what age you were when the original trilogy came out. Like my little brother, who was born in 1988, who grew up watching the original trilogy on VHS, he was the perfect target audience for The Phantom Menace. He was 11 at the time it came out. We bought plastic lightsabers. We were dueling in the front yard, getting excited with the Darth Maul lightsaber prior to going to see this in the theater, and a great time was had by all. However, I fucking hate the prequel trilogy. I hate the sequel trilogy. I pretty much hate everything about Star Wars, apart from the occasional video game or piece of animation, like the Tartakovsky animated Clone Wars were so cool, and we get the occasional video game like Knights of the Old Republic, which I like. But I'm more than happy just for my love and affection for Star Wars to be kind of confined within the original 3 movies. And I'll never forget sitting on my couch when I had not seen The Phantom Menace yet, but a friend of mine who had gone to see it day one, coming back and sitting down on the couch. I looked over, was like, all right, so like, give me the verdict. Like, how is it? And this guy, I mean, he loved Star Wars. He had the laser discs. He was a Star Wars freak, and he just kind of shook his head in weary resignation. He's like, man, there's this guy called Jar Jar, and he's like, I mean, he was just beside himself, perplexed at just how annoying Jar Jar was at that time. And I know people think that we've been too mean about Jar Jar over the years. He's fucking just an earworm. He's a walking, talking earworm where every single line that he says, every physical action that he does, it's all designed for like a 4-year-old. It's, all the silliness and the flips and the physical comedy. None of it works for me. The only thing that works for me in this movie is Darth Maul stepping out, the music kicking in, and it's breathtaking. And you get this kick-ass lightsaber battle. So is the whole movie worth watching for that Darth Maul scene? Fuck yeah, I think I've seen that Darth Maul lightsaber battle 10,000 times. I mean, it is a fantastic moment in Star Wars history, but so much about this movie just feels like a big, giant creative misfire, and just shows how in a few short years, George Lucas had kind of lost interest in the filmmaking process. The George Lucas who directed THX 1138 and American Graffiti and Star Wars, he was not the same man by the time we get to 1999, where he'd made so much money off the toys and the video games and special effects companies and all that stuff. He had become a true, industry icon in so many. He was an institution unto himself. But when you see some of the creative decisions that have been made with the special editions of the original trilogy, all the writing, or I guess all the warnings, were already written on the wall, where if you think it's a good idea to remove iconic sequences from Return of the Jedi and replace it with CGI vomit and new songs. I mean, I remember I was sitting in the theater watching Return of the Jedi in '97 when the new version came out, and just like reacting in horror that like one of my favorite sequences from Jabba's palace had been completely, totally butchered. And I feel the same way about The Phantom Menace. So yeah, Star Wars, if you love the prequels, you were probably a very small child when you saw them, so I totally get it. I was a pissed off 22-year-old when I saw it, so I look at it in a very different light. But let's continue with Notting Hill from May 28th. Saw this in the theater with my parents. They laughed like hell. I thought it was just a bloated, forgettable, sentimental, just awful rom-com, the kind that Julia Roberts made seemingly every other month at this time, including Runaway Bride, which I also did not see, which came out like a month and a half later. There were just too many goddamn Julia Roberts rom-coms. But she was one of the highest paid actors in the world at this time, and Notting Hill was a huge hit. Didn't see The 13th Floor from May 28th, which should not be confused with The 13th Year, which came out like 2 weeks before as a Disney teen comedy, nor should it be confused with The 13th Warrior, which came out in August. But 13th Floor, produced by Roland Emmerich. I don't know if it's good or not. If it is, you tell me. But getting into the first weekend in June 4th, we have a couple of indie flicks. We have John Sayles and his film Limbo, which I also saw in the theater. Not one of John Sayles' finest movies, but worth seeing. Like Lone Star, I'd kind of put him back on the map, but I think his movies like 8 Men Out and Maidawan, those are his better movies. Or even, hell, Return of the Secaucus 7, his first feature film. But if you like John Sayles, you've probably already seen Limbo. But on the same weekend, we also have a documentary about music by Wim Wenders, which I really enjoyed, The Buena Vista Social Club. And I can remember going to see this in the theater, and the moment the music started, the very first song, I was just under its spell, entranced, couldn't believe what I was hearing. I ended up buying the soundtrack, sending it to my old Spanish teacher that I studied with back in high school. And some people have debated some of the claims made about the historical importance of some of the musicians featured in this movie relative to some of the musicians that were left out, but I'm no expert on Cuban music. If you're an expert on that front, let me know what you think of the Buena Vista Social Club. But at a minimum, it opened my eyes to a cool flavor of music that I'd never heard before. And on June 11th, we got yet another major comedy. It just blows my mind how many successful comedies came out in 1999. I mean, I already mentioned Analyze This, and Office Space, and Election, and I guess Cruel Intentions, even to a degree, is kind of funny at times. But 1999 was when we still had giant blockbuster comedies, blockbuster like comedy franchises like Austin Powers, The Spy Who Shagged Me.
Do you swing?
Are you kidding, baby? I put the gar in swinger, baby, yeah!
Which I didn't think was as funny as the first one, International Man of Mystery, which came out, I think, in 97 or 98. But it's still pretty fucking funny. And Heather Graham, at this point, she was just a full-blown, beautiful superstar. She'd already been making movies like Drugstore Cowboy, but then movies like Boogie Nights really just sent her into the stratosphere. I feel like of all the actresses who made a name for themselves with independent films in the early mid-90s, who then achieved mainstream success in the late 90s, Heather Graham is one of the best, and I've maintained a lifelong love and affection for her ever since I saw her in License to Drive in the late 80s. But if you like the Austin Powers shtick, I'm sure you've already seen The Spy Who Shagged Me many times over. I actually never saw Goldmember, but the first one, I think it's always worth revisiting. But if you really want to get an idea of just how much movie-going culture has changed since the late 90s relative to 2024, the fact that we used to have comedy franchises that would generate massive amounts of box office, I mean, now, how many comedy franchises are there out there now at all? Like, none. And so, anyway, if you want to do the proper compare and contrast from a quarter century ago to now, I feel like the comedy genre is where you can see the most significant change. But I've talked a lot of shit about Disney in this video. However, the one exception would be, or one of two exceptions, the animated film Tarzan, June 16th. I did see this in the theater. I did enjoy it, and that it helps that it had that kick-ass Phil Collins tune, which really helped kind of propel it to the heights that it reached. But it was a success. It just shows how Disney could still crank out a good old-fashioned 2D classic animated movie at this time. And is it as good as like Lion King or Aladdin? No, but it was still well worth seeing. But on June 18th, we had a movie which I had to bail on. I tried watching it last night, but we had The General's Daughter by director Simon West. Simon West had done Con Air 2 years earlier, which was a huge hit. I tried watching General's Daughter, and the moment John Travolta, who's admittedly undercover in his role in the movie as a Southerner, but hearing John Travolta doing a Southern accent, I just couldn't handle it. So after like 20 minutes, I turned that fucker off. But it's just forgettable genre fare. It might have made money. It might not have. I don't really know. But this was, I feel like The General's Daughter, it represents a certain type of mainstream Hollywood movie at this time, where you had what were like the equivalent of like thrillers that you see on the rack in a grocery store that would then be blown up to these big forgettable genre films. But Hollywood, for all of its flaws in the late 90s, at least it did attempt to do other genres apart from fucking superheroes. So General's Daughter is that kind of forgettable genre fare that you could see quite a lot of at that time. And there are more movies like this on the list later in the video. But on the same weekend, we had quite a different movie, where this movie came out in 1998 in Germany, but it came out on June 18th in America, and it was Run, Lola, Run. And it's that rare beast from this period where, looking back on the 90s, it's easy to get sentimental about saying, like, oh, like we had all these great independent films and foreign films that were being distributed by Miramax, and what a great time it was for kind of indie fare or low-budget movies. But there weren't a lot of European movies that really took off and did well. Like Trainspotting would be an exception, but obviously that's in English. But Run, Lola, Run was that rare beast where it was this cool, edgy, stylish, international movie that just had this propulsive forward momentum, kick-ass soundtrack, just had this energy to it that it was unmistakable. And so if you want to watch some, there are not a lot of international movies on this list because I'm primarily focusing on Hollywood movies or movies that generated box office in the US, but Run, Lola, Run was pretty goddamn cool. But on June 23rd, you had a movie make its premiere at the Chinese Theater, and then went wide on June 30th. And this is that rare comedy franchise that is still going strong 25 years later. But we have South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut. I'll never forget in the kind of early fall or late summer of 1997, I'd just gotten back to college for my third year, and this show dropped on Comedy Central, and we couldn't fucking believe it. I mean, we would laugh so hard, we couldn't even hear the dialogue of the show. And then not 2 years later, we had the first big movie, and like it states in the name, it was uncut. And the moment that the characters started cussing, like cussing for real, I mean...
How would you like to go see the school counselor?
How would you like to suck my balls?
What did you say?
It would make you shit your pants with laughter. I mean, or just hearing lines like when Kyle's mom's like, "What's a rim job?"
What the heck is a rim job?
Oh, why, that's when you put your legs behind your head and have someone lick your ass.
It was so fucking funny, and I think the movie's really uneven, and it starts strong and it kind of fades. It's got its moments, but it just feels like such a weird time capsule from this period where like Bill Clinton is still the president in South Park at this time. But the music is incredible. I mean, it's basically a musical. Like there might be more songs in this movie than actual just dramatic scenes with dialogue, but Blame Canada was so popular and so successful. Flash forward to the Oscars in 2000, and Trey Parker and Matt Stone, on acid, went to the Oscars dressed up as Gwyneth Paltrow and Jennifer Lopez in their dresses.
It's just such a magical evening, and everyone looks so spectacular. You know, we just wanted to be a part of it all.
It's a night of magic.
And I've seen them discuss that evening in interviews and how they'd made a vow ahead of time never to acknowledge the dresses they were wearing, that basically while they're walking the red carpet, anytime somebody tried to call attention to their attire, they'd be like, oh, it's just such a magical evening. It's just such an enchanting evening. And they would just keep dodging and dodging. And they said, like, you know, when you're on LSD, if you've ever been on LSD, you very much live like in the moment. And it's all about these kind of transitions where like transitions in light or noise can really get your attention. So like getting out of the limo was like one of those transitions, or getting into the theater. But they said about halfway through the evening, they started to come down and they had not won the Oscar. And they suddenly realized, oh, like I'm feeling kind of horrible or kind of a hangover from the LSD. And I'm dressed like J-Lo sitting in the Oscars. Like maybe this wasn't the best idea, but it's a moment in Hollywood history. And Try to think right now, who are the bad boy kind of rebel filmmakers out there, if there are any. In the late 90s, there were the troublemakers, there were the provocateurs, there were the comedians, people who made us laugh, or people who made us, react in shock and horror and that sort of thing. I think if I were to draw one of many contrasts between 1999 and 2024, it'd be the lack of outlaw directors like Trey Parker and Matt Stone, who are still generating ratings and box office and success all these years later, and still able to generate controversy and still maintain, a finger right on the pulse of the country with some withering social satire. So if you've not seen South Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut in some time, go back and check it out. It has held up very, very well. And just to prove just how diverse the offerings were with the comedy genre at this time, we have another big comedy opening opposite of South Park. We have Big Daddy, which opened on June 25th, which was actually the first movie that I ever worked on. Summer 97 and Summer 98, I worked as an intern at Out of the Blue Entertainment for producer Sid Ganis. And they were working on a script at the time called Guy Gets Kid, and Adam Sandler was huge at this time. We had Billy Madison, Happy Gilmore, The Wedding Singer, and Waterboy was coming. But his movies just kept getting bigger and bigger, and his paychecks kept getting bigger and bigger. And suddenly you had a true rival to Jim Carrey, or somebody who could generate massive blockbuster comedies. And it just blows my mind that you could have two blockbuster comedies opening at the same time in the same month, and both doing well. And yeah, as I talk, it's making me kind of sad and depressed at just how few comedies come out in 2024. But I did get to meet Adam Sandler a few times, and he could not have been nicer. And I'll never forget my horror and embarrassment where I was bringing in like coffee, or I was coming into this conference room where Sandler and all the creative execs and producers were sitting around this large round table. And I said something, and Adam Sandler was like, "Where are you from?" I was like, "Oh, well, I grew up in Virginia and North Carolina." And he started asking me questions about ACC football or ACC basketball, because he's a sports freak, and I know nothing about football or basketball. And I remember being very embarrassed at the time that I could not talk shop with them or talk sports with them. But yeah, I'm a movie guy, not a sports guy. But we have one more movie in the month of June to round out the first half of this year, and that is Wild Wild West, where John Peters finally got his giant fucking spider on the big screen. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, watch An Evening with Kevin Smith, where he talks about his conversations with John Peters about a screenplay for Man of Steel or Superman Lives or Superman Returns, whatever the fuck Kevin Smith's Superman screenplay was titled, where John Peters wanted that movie to end with a giant spider. That movie never got made. Flash forward to Wild Wild West being directed by Barry Sonnenfeld, and the producer John Peters finally got his way. But Barry Sonnenfeld had made a huge name for himself, first as a DP for the Coen brothers, shooting a lot of their early movies like Miller's Crossing. But then he made the jump to director with Addams Family and Men in Black, which was a huge hit. Men in Black and Men in Black 2 definitely really got him going. But Wild Wild West basically sucked in any interest I had in Barry Sonnenfeld's career in perpetuity moving forward. But also, what the hell was it? Get Shorty. That was another Barry Sonnenfeld. He was directing tons of movies in the 90s, but Wild Wild West was a sci-fi blockbuster abomination, which pretty much killed my interest in Barry Sonnenfeld henceforth. But let's get into the back nine, or the back half of 1999, where I'm out of school, I'm out in the world, I'm on the cusp of moving to LA, and in early July 2nd, we got Spike Lee enters the fray with Summer of Sam. And in the late 90s, Spike Lee, he wasn't quite small enough to be like an indie director. He was kind of one of those tweeners where the budgets were getting bigger and his casts were getting better. And along those lines, this was the first movie that really got my attention when it came to Adrian Brody, who will appear again in Liberty Heights later on in this year, working for Barry Levinson. But I think Summer of Sam was one of the perfect movies to showcase the talents of Adrian Brody. And I think he pretty much upstaged every other actor in the movie, including John Leguizamo, who in theory is kind of the star of the movie, but he's just not as good as Adrian Brody. But if you want to see a movie about the craziness that can unfold when people are afraid of an ongoing phenomenon, and I've seen this in New York, whether you're talking about during COVID or during certain hurricanes like Sandy, when New York decides to go nuts, it can really go nuts. But it never went more nuts than with the paranoia of the late 70s, when people were terrified about the son of Sam, who was just, at random killing people all over the city during one of the hottest summers on record. But as far as Spike Lee goes, if you want to talk about his New York movies, I mean, She's Gotta Have It, I think, is a better movie, and Do the Right Thing is definitely a better movie. I think Do the Right Thing is one of the best movies ever made about New York, and so I would steer people toward Do the Right Thing instead of Summer of Sam. But he did not make Do the Right Thing in 1999, so we are talking about Summer of Sam at this point. But moving on to July 9th, this is insane. We have yet another blockbuster comedy. This is the third blockbuster comedy in a matter of weeks. We have American Pie, which grossed over $100 million. And even though it was a comedy that made over $100 million in 1999, that still only places it around like number 17 for the top 10 grossers of the year. But this was a phenomenon. I mean, people were talking about fucking like things being more fun than band camp for months after this. And it launched an entire generation of actors, many of whom have already appeared in a lot of the other movies on this list, movies like Election. But if you were not a moviegoer in the late 90s, it's hard to put this into words, but you would go to see certain comedies where you'd have a packed house, where the theater would be shaking with laughter. And I can remember seeing, like, there's something about Mary, I think that was 97 or 98, where there was a similar phenomenon. But when I went to see fucking American Pie, the theater was rumbling with the thunderous approval of a bunch of people in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I went with a bunch of younger siblings and younger cousins and my parents. We went like, wholesome, family-friendly entertainment for the whole fam. And we all just had a blast. And we talked about it and we were quoting it and just laughing our asses off. And like hearing like, and maybe some people would disapprove, but hearing children who are like in middle school quoting this movie. And we were just holding our sides with laughter. Obviously had Hall of Fame nude scenes and that sort of thing, but American Pie, you want to talk about a comedy that truly feels like it comes from a bygone era, it would be American Pie.
Did I miss anything?
No, you were just in time.
Oh, this is incredible. Oh my God. This is too much.
But it was a justifiable box office phenomenon which launched many, many sequels. On the same weekend, we also have Arlington Road, which I've never seen. The trailer looks terrible, in particular Tim Robbins. But if you love Jeff Bridges and Tim Robbins and movies about suspected terrorists, Arlington Road is out there waiting to be discovered by both you and me. But when July 14th finally rolled around, we all finally got to have a look at the Blair Witch Project. And I've been hearing about this movie for months because there was a bootleg copy of the movie that was like, floating around campus, which I did not see. I never saw the bootleg, but I kept hearing from friends that they've been watching this documentary. They said it was a documentary, not that it was a narrative movie, but that they've been so terrified that they couldn't sleep through the night. And I don't know why I didn't watch that bootleg. Maybe I felt like threatened or annoyed that other people had discovered like a cool cult classic before I had. And so I almost wanted to kind of disregard it as something that would, kind of be, quickly forgotten. But I must admit, when I saw this fucker in the theater, I went a little stoned, I went by myself, and when I came home, I had to spend the night in the house by myself, and every little noise and every little like creak of the house had me like oh shit, like on red alert, because this movie, it's so perfectly played upon the fact that they had, I think, $30,000 to shoot it. And so apart from sound effects out in the dark, they really had nothing to work with to make you afraid, but had an iconic poster with an iconic trailer. And it just worked. I think Artisan Entertainment, when they bought this, they bought it for only like a couple million, and then they went off and grossed like well over $100 million. But the idea of going out into the woods with your friends and making a movie for $30,000, I feel like the 90s had a lot of stories like this, like Clerks. Like, Kevin Smith went out and maxed out a bunch of credit cards, made his movie, paid off his debts, and a career was launched. And I don't feel like we hear those kinds of stories as much anymore. But in a year where we didn't have a ton of horror movies, this is a true, genuine horror classic. And I haven't revisited it in probably over 20 years. I would love to see how well it plays now. But there's no getting around the fact that this was a historic moment for the horror genre. And I feel like every couple of years you get a horror film which defines the present moment in terms of the way teenagers talk to each other, what technology is being employed, like how does the movie have an impact on the culture? And this was that movie. The same way Scream had an impact a couple years earlier and launched all these teen slasher movies all over again. The Blair Witch Project, the found footage horror genre, it wasn't born here. We'd had movies like Cannibal Holocaust, which came out like 20 years prior, but I feel like the found footage horror genre has never really gone away since Blair Witch Project. So yeah, it's definitely one of the most influential horror films ever made. But I should also mention that on the same weekend, we also had Muppets from Space, which I did not see. I basically gave up on the Muppets after Jim Henson died. I feel like the Muppets was the Muppets as long as you had Frank Oz and Jim Henson working side by side, and that the Muppets had never really recovered since then. But on the weekend of July 16th, We've got Lake Placid, which I have to mention because it was made by Phoenix Pictures, and I worked as a reader at Phoenix Pictures for years for Mike Medavoy. This is obviously a couple years before. I started working at Phoenix the summer of '02, so I remember seeing the posters for Lake Placid all over the walls. But I think it's an unforgivably bad movie where even all these acting legends that are in it look ashamed to be there. But if you saw it at the time and liked it, more power to you. We also have the Wood on this weekend starring Omar Epps. I think a lot of people have forgotten about Omar Epps, but for a brief shining moment, Omar Epps, he was the leading man in a ton of flicks at this time. But the big movie that came out July 16th, and it blows my mind that like this was the last time that we could even discuss this filmmaker as having a new movie, Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut. And speaking of which, I've got 2 props which I need to bring back. Hang on, wait one sec. Because I'm a big, giant weirdo and a Stanley Kubrick fanatic and love Halloween, I have not one, but 2 Eyes Wide Shut masks that I like to whip out from time to time. And what that says about me, who can say? But Stanley Kubrick, I think that he's a strong contender for the best filmmaker of the latter half of the 20th century, and some people might cry foul and say, oh, fuck you, it's Akira Kurosawa, or fuck you, it's Federico Fellini, or fuck you, it's this, that, and the other, Ingmar Bergman, whomever. There's a lot of competition for who is the best filmmaker of the latter half of the 20th century. So yeah, pick your own. I like Stanley Kubrick quite a bit, and throughout all of college, my friends and I were fucking obsessed with his movies. I have no idea how many times we sat down and watched his movies. We were studying his movies in our class. Like, it was considered homework to sit around and watch Stanley Kubrick movies. I took a class my first year at UVA called Cinema as an Art Form, where we tackled Full Metal Jacket and Clockwork Orange and Dr. Strangelove. I discovered Dr. Strangelove through that class and remains one of my all-time favorite movies. But he's got, I won't say so many good ones because he only made 12 movies, but of his movies, probably 10 of them are required viewing, many of which I've seen multiple times. Eyes Wide Shut, I don't rank as one of his best, but I've still seen it probably 6 or 7 times. But it's a weird thing where it's this erotic mystery, kind of psychological drama adapted from the novel Traum Nouvelle by Arthur Schnitzler. But in spite of it being a movie which is going to give us, promise to give us Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise buck-ass nude on the big screen, it's strangely unarousing as a movie. It's got its moments, like when Nicole Kidman, when we see her in the fantasies of Tom Cruise, where he's just like, wrapped in like insecurity and jealousy and like, inadequacy, and thinking about this story that she told him about this big, handsome sailor character, getting it on with her. And she never even got it on with her. She was just thinking, she tells him basically, I would have given up our entire life together to have one night with this guy. And it's broken Tom Cruise's brain. But those fantasies in his mind, I do think actually are erotic, but they last for seconds. But like the big orgy sequences and that sort of thing, there's a lot of nudity, but for me, I guess eroticism is a weird thing where you never know what's going to happen with like brain chemistry, but it helps if it feels as if like the filmmaker is turned on by what they're filming. And I don't think that Stanley Kubrick was turned on, or if he was, then he was very clever at disguising it. But in the lead up to the release of this movie, I was absolutely petrified by what I might see because Stanley Kubrick died that spring. I remember I was sitting on the couch, a friend of mine came in, and he just announced, by the way, Stanley Kubrick died. And I turned and I was like, what the fuck did you just say? He's like, Stanley Kubrick's dead. I was like, if you're fucking with me, we're going to have a fight, like right now. He said, I'm not fucking with you. He's like, turn on the news, like you'll see it. And my first thought was not, like what a shame that a great filmmaker has died. My first thought was Warner Brothers is going to ruin the movie because Stanley Kubrick was notorious for editing and sound mixing right up to the last minute. And I knew if he had a few more months to finesse the movie that he would. And I just worry that they would betray him in his death and recut it or do something. The reality is I will never be completely satisfied that the version of Eyes Wide Shut that we have is the final version that Stanley Kubrick would have released, because I do think he would have, editing, if you shave half a second off a scene, it can have such a huge impact on just the kind of subtle emotional power of a scene. And I do think he would have continued to mess with it, but It's worth watching. I like Sidney Pollack's performance in it quite a bit. I like Tom Cruise in it. I like Nicole Kidman in it. And there's so many scenes that I love and adore. I don't feel like the movie ever completely comes together in a total satisfying whole in the same way that a movie like The Shining does, or The Killing, or Paths of Glory, or Lolita, or any of his classic movies. Barry Lyndon, he's got so many good ones. But fuck it. It's the last time Stanley Kubrick got a chance to release a movie, and it's the only time I've had a chance to quote-unquote review a Stanley Kubrick movie on this channel, so I need to do a big, giant Stanley Kubrick video on this channel moving forward, because I've been recording for about 90 minutes at this point, and I'm only halfway through the video, so it's time to move on, whether I like it or not. So later that month, on July 23rd, we have Inspector Gadget. Hard pass. Grew up watching the cartoon in the early 80s. I gave less than 0 fucks about the live-action Disney remake, whatever you want to fucking call it, for Inspector Gadget. And every time Disney comes up, I can just feel this this bile coming up, all this hate and venom. So I should just move on. Drop Dead Gorgeous, also July 23rd. Never saw it, but I've seen a lot of clips with Amy Adams over the years. And Amy Adams, I mean, she was just getting started. She is glorious in this. Like Denise Richards, while she might have been the hot big celebrity at this time, Amy Adams, future Hollywood royalty on display, just being fucking beautiful and hilarious every step of the way with every inch of screen time that they gave her.
Hi, Pat. Go Muskies! Woo!
On the same weekend, we also have The Haunting, directed by Jan de Bont. How the Mighty Have Fallen. I skipped this, but Jan de Bont, I mean, he got to start as a DP for Paul Verhoeven. Paul Verhoeven, one of my all-time favorite filmmakers. They worked together many, many times, but at a certain point, Jan de Bont, he wanted to be a director. He wanted to go his own way, and he had some successes, movies like Twister, which did well. I think he also did Speed. Did Jan de Bont do Speed and Twister? In any case, by the time you get to The Haunting, I'll never forget sitting in the theater thinking, oh my God, these actors, like I like all these actors, but their dialogue's so annoying and these special effects look so horrible. I skipped it then, I'm skipping it now. I will never see The Haunting. But on July 28th, we have a full-blown genre classic, a cult classic, Deep Blue Sea, a movie which I skipped at the time, but I think now, looking back, it's one of the most entertaining, just pure, raw, entertaining movies of 1999. And if you've never seen it and don't want any spoilers, skip the next like 20 or 30 seconds or so, but I can remember skipping this for a long time, just thinking like people are talking themselves into liking a bad movie because they think it's fun to like bad movies. And that does happen periodically where people just decide no matter what happens, we like this movie and everything that it represents. But when I finally saw Deep Blue Sea years later, I could not believe just how outrageous it was and how trashy it was, like gloriously trashy. And that scene with Samuel L. Jackson when he's given the big inspirational speech, which was very common with Hollywood movies at the time. And I feel like it's the ultimate kind of Gen X fuck you to mainstream Hollywood to have a big giant shark come out and bite him right in the middle of his big inspirational speech. So that scene is fantastic. But this movie is littered with fantastic scenes where you've got really smart sharks killing really stupid people. It's glorious. Hunt it down. You will not regret it.
And we're going to find a way to get out of here. First, we're gonna seal off this
Closing out July, we have a little indie flick, Twin Falls, Idaho, on July 30th, which I did see in the theater. I moved to LA like early August 1999, and I immediately, instead of looking for work, just started going to see every single movie that was out in the theater that I was not able to see when I was living in Virginia and North Carolina. My home was in North Carolina, my school was in Virginia, but I just didn't have access to a lot of independent flicks, and so I just went on a murderous rampage, and Twin Falls, Idaho is one of those movies directed by the Polish brothers. They are twins. They've had a nice, long, healthy career since then. That same weekend, though, we also have Runaway Bride. I fucking hate Gary Marshall. I hate Gary Marshall movies. He made nothing but chick flicks, and anyone who makes a movie like The Other Sister should just get barred from making movies for life, but he bounced back 6 months later with a movie which was one of the highest box office earners of the entire year. So it shows that people have very short memories even after an atrocity like The Other Sister. But let's keep things positive with our next movie, which on July 31st made its premiere at the Chinese Theater and then went wide on August 6th. The Iron Giant, a movie which remains beloved to the present day. Brad Bird had been doing good work over on like The Simpsons, but he came out of nowhere with this animated classic, a 2D animated classic, and only a few years later will be giving us yet another animated classic with The Incredibles, which I still think is maybe the best movie Pixar ever made. I think Brad Bird's a goddamn genius, but for whatever reason, it doesn't work that often. But the characters of the Iron Giant and just the look and the style. I mean, the fact that the Iron Giant can make an appearance 20 years later in a movie like, what the fuck was that Spielberg movie, which I hated? Ready Player One. But like people still love the Iron Giant even when he appears in a stupid movie like Ready Player One. But this movie absolutely lives up to the hype and is a true animated classic and not a Disney movie. It just... I never want to overlook an opportunity to talk a little shit about Disney. But on August 4th, we had a little comedy which I've never seen starring Kirsten Dunst and Michelle Williams. We have Dick. Kirsten Dunst, I mean, she had a big year this year. She was also in Drop Dead Gorgeous. Kirsten Dunst starts appearing on a lot of things. And then the following year, she would appear in Virgin Suicides. And she'd already been in friggin' the Interview with the Vampire like a couple of years prior. So Kirsten Dunst was definitely making a name for herself. But Michelle Williams, she has earned herself many, many fans over the last 25 years. So at some point, I probably should go back and check out Dick and just see what it's all about. But it's all about Richard Nixon. It's not about dicks, if that's what you're thinking. But August 6th, we have yet another blockbuster horror film. And this is only a couple of weeks after the Blair Witch Project, but we've got M. Night Shyamalan, The Sixth Sense, with the #2 movie of the year with $293 million domestic. Named the last time a horror film was the #2 movie of any given year. Now, in the 25-year interim since The Sixth Sense, it's gotten very fashionable and very trendy to poke fun at M. Night Shyamalan, and I've been very guilty of that as well. He's made so many just awful, unwatchable, unforgivably stupid movies which he thinks just have like, smell like fucking roses in spite of all evidence to the contrary. But for a brief shining moment when this movie came out, everybody thought he was going to be the next Steven Spielberg. I mean, people were already declaring that here was the next like golden boy who was going to be like basically like his own one-man band, standalone dream factory, just cranking out genre films moving forward. And his movies did continue to generate box office for a couple movies. I don't think any of them are as good as The Sixth Sense. And I don't think The Sixth Sense is actually that good if you really look long and hard at like the rules it establishes and how those rules are a little inconsistent when applied throughout. But in the theater by myself watching it in the summer of 1999, I screamed like a little bitch. I mean, I'll never forget when the zipper of the little tent's coming down and you see that ghost girl with like the vomit coming out of her mouth. And I went, I made this sound like, ah! And everybody around me in the theater just started cracking up because I hadn't like, it wasn't like a normal yell. It caught me so off guard. And even now in 2024, watching the trailer, it still kind of sort of gives me the heebie-jeebies when the little boy tells his mom that the ghost is right outside his window.
Where is she?
Standing next to my window.
Ooh! So this was I won't say a once-in-a-generation horror phenomenon, but it's so cool seeing a year where you've got so many different kinds of hits. Like when you look at the top 10, you should see horror, comedy, historical epics. Like you should see or like just weird freak show off the beaten path, character-driven dramas. I think variety and choice is always a healthy sign for any sort of era of entertainment. And I would give my right arm to see the horror genre get this popular again. But who knows what 2024 might bring us. But on the same weekend, we also have the Thomas Crown Affair, which I did see, remake of the classic from the late 60s. See the original. You cannot replace Steve McQueen and Faye Dunaway. Even though I like Rene Russo and I like Pierce Brosnan, but see the original film. But on the same weekend again, a movie which I have not seen and never will see, Mystery Men, starring Ben Stiller. It's the kind of superhero movie that we used to get in the late 90s, where maybe we'll start seeing some superhero movies like this now, but it's kind of poking fun at superheroes. And at this time, the wounds from Batman and Robin still were too deep. But terrible superhero movies were in a lot of ways kind of the norm in the late 90s. Like I know people love Blade. Blade was the exception, not the rule. The rule was usually movies like Steel, starring Shaquille O'Neal. Mystery Men felt like another one of those movies. Maybe I've overlooked an unacknowledged classic, but I just can't fucking watch Mystery Men. And then on August 13th, we got a Frank Oz comedy, Bowfinger. I don't count Bowfinger as one of the great comedies of this year, but it was a funny movie. It actually works. I mean, it's Eddie Murphy, Steve Martin, doing what they do. It's making fun of Hollywood. It's just not as funny as some of the other big comedies that came out this year, but it shows, once again, the comedy genre was in a very healthy, vigorous place at this point. And then the same weekend, we have 2 more movies which I've not seen. Broke Down Palace, starring Kate Beckinsale and Claire Danes, and Detroit Rock City. August 20th, we have Kevin Williamson, after the runaway success of Scream, which he wrote, switching to writer-director for Teaching Mrs. Tingle, starring Helen Mirren. I've never seen this. I suspect it probably is a pretty cool little dark comedy, but I've never checked it out, so y'all tell me. But on the same weekend, August 20th, we have yet another movie which I have seen, Universal Soldier: The Return. Now, back in 1992, I saw the first Universal Soldier, and I loved it unironically. It's a terrible movie, but I was still young enough where I felt like every science fiction movie was kind of good, no matter what. And I love Jean-Claude Van Damme. I love Dolph Lundgren. So I was a fan of Universal Soldier, and I would defend it tooth and nail. But Jean-Claude Van Damme, from 1992 to 1999, his career kind of jumped the rails, and his movies stopped performing. It was a very good time to be Jean-Claude Van Damme in the late 80s and early 90s. And even though he had sworn never to come back to this franchise...
No. Been there, done that.
By 1999, he was ready, and he had Michael Jai White, who is fucking jacked beyond words and ready to kind of take the baton as the next kind of cool, low-budget action movie star. And Michael Jai White, he's still making movies. And we also had Goldberg in here, and I'd just seen Goldberg wrestle. My one pro wrestling event that I attended live featured Goldberg. But this movie is just awful, and it's just the most generic, predictable, routine sci-fi action flick imaginable. At least it has one gratuitous nude scene in a strip club where this brawl erupts. So anytime you have Universal soldiers and naked ladies all fighting, well, you can't go but so wrong. But this is one of those shameless, crappy, low-budget action flicks that just steals liberally from every other successful action movie, even going so far as to steal from T2 with a liquid nitrogen death for one of the villains, followed by a head kick. I love everybody involved in this, but this movie's just god-awful. So let's move on to August 27th, where this might be one of my few kind of hot takes where I get some pushback, but I don't like The 13th Warrior. And I've got some friends who love and adore the fantasy genre, who speak very highly of it, but I love the source material Beowulf, which I read in high school. It's one of the great kind of epic ballads with dragons and monsters and murder and all kinds of crazy shit. I think even the Robert Zemeckis animated movie of Beowulf, which I hate, is kind of superior to this, but I've watched it twice. I don't know what I'm missing. I don't know why my friends who like the same kind of stuff I like seem to get so much pleasure from this when it just leaves me cold. But I'm just gonna, in the interest of time, I'm just gonna move on. But we had The Muse from director Albert Brooks, also on the same day, August 27th. I think Albert Brooks has made better movies like Modern Romance. I think is a much better movie than The Muse. I think Lost in America is a much better movie than The Muse. Actually, I'm not the world's biggest fan of Albert Brooks as a director, but I like him as an actor. Like, I loved him in Out of Sight, and I loved him in Taxi Driver. Like, Albert Brooks, he's got chops. But I think The Muse is just kind of silly. But it does have a nice little cameo by Martin Scorsese and James Cameron as themselves in it. So check it out. Your mileage may vary when it comes to the Albert Brooks flavor of comedy. But speaking of comedies, we also have Dudley Do-Right, which I did not see. And even though I've said repeatedly throughout this video that I love the fact that we have so much variety in the comedy genre in 1999, maybe too much variety is not necessarily a good thing if it leads to movies like Dudley Do-Right. And then for our last summer movie, we've got The Astronaut's Wife on August 27th as well. Very expensive movie, huge bomb. You got Johnny Depp and Charlize Theron, both who were huge at that time. I mean, they're still legends in 2024, but I did not see this. I think it's been turned into a TV show or another movie since then. I've never read The Astronaut's Wife. I've never seen any of the adaptations. All I know is that this movie basically lost every single dollar that was invested in it at that time. But let's start slipping into the fall, or easing into the fall, with a movie which I skipped hard and very deliberately and very willfully on September 1st, Chill Factor. I can remember seeing the trailer on TV and thinking to myself that I never want to see a movie with Skeet Ulrich or Cuba Gooding Jr. ever again. And I already mentioned before how a lot of the kind of starlets from the mid-90s suffered from overexposure in the late 90s. And there's something about watching Cuba Gooding Jr. just doing his screaming routine, which he basically was never allowed to stop doing after it was popular in Jerry Maguire. And then Skeet Ulrich kind of doing these like cocky, stupid reactions to everything that Cuba was saying. Just everything about the trailer rubbed me the wrong way. And when I rewatched the trailer just yesterday, getting prepared for this video, I still had the exact same revulsion to the exact same bit. So I'm going to share it for y'all just so y'all can have revulsion for it too.
Take your gun! Doesn't work. It's not even loaded. You hijacked me with an empty gun! When this is all over, remind me to kick your ass!
But as far as release dates go, there was a very important movie which made its premiere on September 8th at the Egyptian, but it didn't go wide until October 1st and had a limited release on September 15th. I'm not quite sure when I should insert it, but let's talk about a few others first. On the same day, September 10th, Stir of Echoes and Stigmata. I saw Stigmata in the theater. I saw Stir of Echoes later on in DVD. I have no memory of Stir of Echoes. I remember kind of sort of liking Stigmata, but that's because at that time I was a big Patricia Arquette fan due to Lost Highway. But I don't really remember it all that well. But if you like horror films and you like Patricia Arquette, hunt it down. But on September 17th, we had yet another Martin Lawrence film, Blue Streak. We had a Sam Raimi movie, but an unconventional one, For Love of the Game, starring Kevin Costner, where you can see Sam Raimi definitely starting to slide into more mainstream terrain, because prior to that, his most mainstream movie had been A Simple Plan. But what we really knew Sam Raimi for at this point was the Evil Dead trilogy and movies like Darkman. But suddenly when he made For Love of the Game, I was like, what? Because I'd been the co-founder of the Dead by Dawn Society in my high school. I love Sam Raimi, but I didn't want to see him start making dad movies prematurely. Luckily, only a few years later, he was able to make Spider-Man, which was just a fucking blast. And Spider-Man 2 was even better. But I think he needed to make For Love of the Game to prove to mainstream Hollywood, I'm not just the guy who makes movies with Bruce Campbell off in the woods. I can do other things. So high five to Sam Raimi for making that career pivot. But on the same weekend, we also have Splendor from director Greg Araki. If you don't know who Greg Araki is, he was famous for movies like The Doom Generation. But if you want to see movies about teenagers basically fucking and sucking everything that moves, irrespective of gender or skin color, he was a very broad-minded guy when it came to depicting sexuality of young people in the 1990s. And he was pretty hardcore, and I like some of his other movies more, but Splendor, it was well worth hunting down. And then on the last weekend of September, September 24th, we've got Jacob the Liar, which felt like a ripoff of Life is Beautiful, but it was actually a remake of a 1975 movie. But this starred Robin Williams, and Robin Williams, after the kind of, the acclaim of Good Will Hunting, suddenly he started getting all these kind of dramas and feel-good movies that were being offered to him. And R.I.P. Robin Williams. He was an absolute legend, but he made some really obnoxious movies. For every movie that he made that was genuinely moving, like The Dead Poets Society, he would then go off and do all these awful movies like Bicentennial Man, which comes later in 1999. But I skipped Jacob Liar at the time, and it just felt like, here's a guy who has kind of lost touch with his funny bones or his roots and is now trying to make Oscar bait. But we also have The Minus Man. I saw The Minus Man in A State of Altered Consciousness. I believe I was at the New Art. But it was written and directed by the guy who did the screenplay adaptation of Blade Runner. I remember the star. I remember the poster. I remember nothing about the movie. I can't tell you anything about The Minus Man. But we also have Double Jeopardy, directed by Bruce Beresford. And this is one of those movies like, what the hell was I talking about earlier? General's Daughter. Or I feel like it's a vanished species in Hollywood. These big budget, trashy genre movies that just felt like thrillers or paperbacks you pick up at a drugstore, but would employ giant movie stars. And this movie, in spite of withering reviews, made piles of money. It shows that Ashley Judd and Tommy Lee Jones still had a ton of star power. And in the late 90s, stars still mattered. Even if your movie was a complete and total stinking pile of shit, if you had recognizable, beloved stars, you could probably get away with it. And Ashley Judd and Tommy Lee Jones were still very popular. I tried watching this movie yesterday. I got about 20 minutes in. I was like, had to bail hard. But I'm glad I at least gave it a chance. And in a weird way, I kind of felt a little nostalgia for the great era, or the last, kind of the end of the star vehicle era, because in the early 2000s, suddenly what really mattered was the franchise. Marvel, like Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, didn't matter. But the franchise was king, and stars started to lose power. And I feel like stars lost more power with the onset of social media, when anybody could be a star, and stars started kind of oversharing. I feel like in the 90s, stars were still a little mysterious and felt a little otherworldly. Like when you saw a star in person, you just like, whoa, it was like seeing a fucking alien. And yeah, 1999 is kind of the end of that era. But let's get into October And I'm going to go back to the movie that I teased. Once again, made its premiere on September 8th, limited release on September 15th, then went wide on October 1st. I don't think this movie's perhaps aged as well as people thought it would at the time, but American Beauty was a monster movie at that time. And if you want to talk about movies that are the kind of endangered species or vanished species from the late 90s that we never see anymore, it's movies like American Beauty, where you've got a young filmmaker, Sam Mendes, making his directorial debut, shooting a movie with an aging legend, Conrad Hall. Conrad Hall had been shooting movies like In Cold Blood in the late 60s, but was a true legend of his craft. And then using a variety of young and aging talent, like you have Annette Bening, Kevin Spacey, Thora Birch, Mina Suvari, Wes Bentley, the list goes on and on. But this is one of those movies that felt edgy enough or kind of risky enough or transgressive enough where it lure in the young people like, oh, this is kind of cool and kind of shocking and kind of provocative and sexual and so on and so forth. But it also had kind of like, I guess, the stink of legitimacy or the stink of prestige where it could be a major Oscar contender, an awards contender. And very rarely does Hollywood make these anymore. Like movies that generate box office, awards, a little bit of controversy. I mean, Thora Birch, she has a nude scene and she wasn't even 18. Her parents were there on the set and they signed up, said, yeah, sure, this is an artistic film by all means. I'm like, is that even legal? Like, I don't know, but it's in the movie to the present day. But if any movie screams 1999 to me, I mean, you could say The Matrix, you could say Blair Witch Project, but I think American Beauty deserves to be mentioned alongside any of the other movies that kind of are representative of this moment in our pop culture history. And on the same goddamn weekend, we have a couple other major movies. We got Jay Roach's hockey film, Mystery Alaska. I missed it at the time, or I've skipped it, but I finally did watch it. I had an interview with Jay Roach, I think in 2002 or 3. I was working in accounting, so it would have been 2002. But I had an interview with him. I can't even remember what the interview was for. I think he was hiring like an army of assistants for his next movie, whatever it might be. But like, you know what? I better see all of his movies ahead of time. And so I saw Mystery Alaska. And if you like hockey movies, it's a moving, inspirational movie. I just think if you want to watch like a good hockey movie, watch either The Goon Part 2, which is hilarious, or watch Slapshot, which is an all-time classic. But on the same weekend, we also have Three Kings. Back when David O. Russell was considered like an independent filmmaker, he'd made Spankin' the Monkey and Flirting with Disaster. And those had been very popular. Super low budget, but absolutely hilarious. Super, like basically he was like the poster child for the provocative, young, edgy, indie director. But here he is working with fucking movie stars, George Clooney, Ice Cube. And Ice Cube, after Friday, was transitioning very rapidly to a full-blown movie star. And you've also got Mark Wahlberg and Spike Jonze. Spike Jonze acting instead of directing. I didn't even really know who the fuck Spike Jonze was at that time, but a few weeks later, I would, when he would release his directorial debut, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes. But Three Kings, I've not seen it in 25 years. I don't know how well it's aged. I remember certain scenes really well. I remember enjoying it. But this is a movie about the Desert Shield and Desert Storm in Iraq in the early 90s. And it just seems like any movie about Iraq probably hasn't aged particularly well unless it also incorporates somehow magically the Iraq War, which came a few years later. Obviously, in 1999, no one knew that the war in Iraq would be erupting in a few short years. Remember, this is a pre-9/11 era. It's a very innocent, naive time. So I probably should go back and revisit Three Kings, but it's hard to feel compelled to do so in that it's about a very specific moment in time. And obviously, there's been a lot of water under the bridge in that region in the interim. And then on October 7th, we have a movie which I would not regard as one of the best movies by this director, but it does cover some of the best movies by the director. But we have My Best Fiend, where director Werner Herzog is going over his history with all-time kind of savage madman Klaus Kinski and the many movies they made together, as well as the time that they lived together in Germany back in the day. So I would definitely recommend people see Aguirre, The Wrath of God, or Fitzcarraldo, some of these other movies first. But after you've seen those, definitely see My Best Fiend. And then on October 8th, we have one of my favorite movies of 1999. I think arguably the best movie of Steven Soderbergh's career, but we have The Limey. And Steven Soderbergh had made a huge comeback a year prior with his film Out of Sight, which fucking rocks. I mean, Out of Sight, great adaptation of a great Elmore Leonard novel. George Clooney and Jennifer Lopez, they were never better, never more charismatic, never more sexy. But then instead of going bigger with this budget or bigger with this scale and scope, he went smaller with the Limey, which really allowed him to be as personal and experimental as he liked. And there was a time where Steven Soderbergh was an incredibly experimental director, making movies like Schizopolis. And I think the editing of the Limey is some of the most sophisticated editing that I've ever seen. And if you were to count the number of times that I've seen the different movies that came out in 1999, I think I've seen The Matrix more than any other. The Limey might be my number 2 for the total number of times that I've seen the movies of 1999. But I think it's one of the best gangster films of the 90s, and it's got plenty of healthy competition on that front in that genre. In the 90s, The Limey, solid gold, and it is aged like a goddamn fine wine. Definitely hunt it down if you've not seen it. But on that same weekend, we have Superstar, starring Molly Shannon, which I've never seen. I love Molly Shannon, but for whatever reason, I've never seen that. A lot of those SNL like movie adaptations of popular characters and sketches didn't really translate all that well, and so I had a bit of an aversion to SNL movies in the late 90s. And we also have Random Hearts, directed by Sidney Pollack. And I mean, I love Kristen Scott Thomas. I love Harrison Ford. I love Sidney Pollack. But this is one boring fucking movie. It's got its moments, but Kristen Scott Thomas, after The English Patient, she stood for like glamour and prestige and beauty and elegance. But nothing makes you seem less elegant than doing a terrible American accent, which she does in Random Hearts. If you're going to watch a movie by Sidney Pollack, I would recommend, Out of Africa or Tootsie or Jeremiah Johnson or Bobby Deerfield. I mean, both as an actor in movies like The Player or as a director, Sidney Pollack had a fantastic career. Or as an actor, Husbands and Wives? Was it Husbands and Wives? Yeah, Husbands and Wives by Woody Allen in the early 90s. He's incredible. But Random Hearts, it basically put me to sleep. But I did finish it. But the following weekend, October 15th, is an overcrowded weekend, but let's just tackle them one at a time. I'll start with The Story of Us, which is Rob Reiner at his most sentimental. I skipped the shit out of this movie, saw the trailer, and I remember just wanting to kill myself as it unfolded. It just seemed so self-important and so smug and so sad and weepy and so sentimental. Anyway, watch the trailer if you don't believe me. I like Rob Reiner movies like Princess Bride or This is Spinal Tap, but yeah, I've got no use for the Rob Reiner who got increasingly self-important as he got older and fatter and grayer. But we also have Julian Donkey Boy from director Harmony Korine. Gummo, which came out I think 2 years prior, has gone down in history as what is regarded as the worst date movie ever made. But I love Gummo. I revisited it like a year or so ago, and it's held up very, very well. But Julian Donkey Boy was Harmony Korine's follow-up feature. He'd written Kids for Larry Clark, then did Gummo, then did this. And you've got Werner Herzog here. And I was just getting into Werner Herzog's movies as a director when I saw this. I'd seen like 2 or 3 at this point. But just seeing him like spraying his son with a hose and like talking shit and trying to like teach him to be a champion was just astonishing. But at a time where a lot of the edgy indie directors seemed to be selling out and going mainstream and making big budget movies that felt increasingly stupid and cheesy and bland, he was a real independent filmmaker still making movies that were designed essentially to like drive people out of the theater, which maybe that's not necessarily your goal if you're an investor in one of these movies. But Harmony Korine, he has always been an uncompromising director, and his output is uneven. But at this time, he was definitely one of the most kind of brutal and offensive and upsetting directors out there. And I feel like if you don't have a few Harmony Korines in your independent film scene in any given era, well, then you don't really have an independent cinema to even speak of. But also on the same weekend, we have a movie which I referenced earlier in the video. We have a Disney movie directed by David Lynch, The Straight Story. Yes, there was a time where Disney was at least broad-minded enough with their slate in terms of genre and different types of stories where there was room for a David Lynch to make a comeback, because Lost Highway had lost money for October Films. David Lynch's career was kind of in trouble. But Straight Story put him back on firm footing. It was beautifully shot. It was emotionally compelling. You have some incredible performances. And if I'm talking about David Lynch movies like Mulholland Drive and Blue Velvet and those kinds of movies are much more my speed, but Straight Story is damn good. I've seen it twice, and I remember loving it when I saw it in the theater at that time. So it just shows once again just how many astonishingly good filmmakers were active at the same time, putting their best foot forward. But on the same weekend, speaking of putting your best foot forward, we have a movie with massive cultural staying power, probably more cultural staying power than any other movie released this year. I'm talking about Fight Club, directed by David Fincher, adapted from the 1996 novel by Chuck Palahniuk. But even here in 2024, I feel like you could walk up to a young person and say, what's the first rule of Fight Club? And they're going to know the answer. And I think I even heard it referenced a couple times in the movie Bottoms last year. But I can remember going to see this with my sister, a friend of hers, and my roommate at the Cinerama Dome in LA. And if you don't know what the Cinerama Dome is, it's basically this giant like golf ball in the middle of Hollywood with one of the world's biggest movie screens. And maybe it's closed down these days. I can't quite remember. But packed house, people were hell bent upon seeing this movie. And for whatever reason, this giant, huge, muscular, stinking drunk dude was sitting beside us. And you could smell the booze coming off of him in waves. But as the movie continued, I could tell it was having an effect on him, like the philosophy and the dialogue and the violence. And the guy, he kept kind of like rising up out of his seat. And at one point, like this organized crime figure in the movie comes along, and he either beats up Ed Norton's character or Brad Pitt's character. I can't remember which character he beats up, but he's doing it. And the guy beside us started going like, kick his fucking ass. And he kept rising up. I was like, is this guy just going to like go on a shooting spree and kill all of us? But finally, about halfway through the movie, he stood up and said, I'm out of here. And he just stormed out of the theater to God knows where. But my most enduring memory of Fight Club is that guy who was having an unhealthy response to the movie. But this is why David Fincher is still making movies all these years later. While movies like Seven are bigger hits, the cultural staying power of a movie like Fight Club is just undeniable. But all the stars, Helena Bonham Carter, Brad Pitt, Ed Norton, they're all so goddamn goodness. The look of it's great. Like, it's hard to think of another time where you've had like a mainstream movie, a big budget movie shot in such an artful way with like a philosophy and an ideology that's like being like explored by the author Chuck Palahniuk. But in the late 90s, movies like Fight Club would still come along every once in a while. And yeah, if you were going to put up a list of like the top 5 or top 10 most influential movies of 1999, trend-setting movies, game-changing movies, Fight Club is obviously going to be part of that conversation. But let's move on to a forgettable movie from October 18th, which I did not see. Luc Besson's The Messenger, the story of Joan of Arc. At this time, I liked Luc Besson. I enjoyed The Fifth Element, but as far as Joan of Arc is concerned, I only had eyes for Carl Theodor Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc, because this is when I was at the absolute zenith of my film snobbery. So, yeah, you needed to be, a Danish art house classic from the silent era to get my attention when it came to Joan of Arc at this time. And then on October 22nd, we have 5 fucking releases on October 22nd. I mean, people laugh about like kind of award seasons now and how in the fall you get all your prestige films and your art house films and your independent films and foreign films, blah, blah, blah. But in the late 90s, you really saw that phenomenon at play. So let's just tackle these movies one at a time. So we've got Crazy in Alabama starring Antonio Banderas and Melanie Griffith. This is when they were like the big celebrity couple of this moment. I skipped this on purpose. I love both of these actors. I mean, Antonio Banderas is a total fucking stud. Loved him in Desperado, and Melanie Griffith, I mean, how do you top a movie like Body Double by Brian De Palma? I skipped Crazy in Alabama. I don't feel any guilt about it. We also have Bringing Out the Dead, Martin Scorsese teaming up with Paul Schrader and DP Robert Richardson. If you want to see a Nick Cage movie from this period, see this. It's a stylish movie. It's an interesting movie. My big problem is, though, is that everything that it tries to do was done better by Taxi Driver like 25 years earlier. I mean, you got... I wouldn't say similar terrain, but New York in the 1970s is a very different place from New York in the late 90s, although this movie's set in the early 90s. But Scorsese and Paul Schrader, they were just fucking leaner and meaner and edgier and just more savage in the 70s, and they weren't the same guys by the time they returned to this terrain. They probably should have just maybe not made this movie, because it just feels like a pale shade compared to past glories by these storytellers. But we've also got Body Shots from October 22nd. I've never seen this. I've seen the nude scenes featuring Tara Reid, because Tara Reid was one of the sexiest young things from this period. I mean, the previous year she'd been in Big Lebowski, and the same year she was also in American Pie. I mean, Tara Reid suddenly was everywhere. But the trailer, take one look at the trailer, and you're like, oh my God, this looks cheesy as fucking shit, and I had no interest in seeing it. But the big movie of October 22nd is Boys Don't Cry, which won Hilary Swank an Oscar and made her an overnight star. I mean, between this and movies like $1 Million Baby, but obviously Hilary Swank's had a fantastic career, but it all started with Boys Don't Cry. We had a weird thing where a bunch of different people were trying to bring this story to the screen, where they are all talking to different people involved and acquiring the rights to their story. But it's like, if you're dealing with true history, it's like, what is the definitive version? But luckily, it seems like the right movie made it to the screen, and Boys Don't Cry was definitely one of the big runaway success stories as far as like low budget indie movies are concerned of this period. And Chloe Sevigny, I was basically watching every single movie she appeared in at this time. And then on the weekend of October 29th, we have 3 movies. We have House on Haunted Hill, which at the time appeared to be yet another bland horror movie with an interchangeable cast of young starlets. I skipped the fuck out of it. I think after The Haunting, earlier that summer, I'd had all the hauntings that I could handle in one year. So maybe I was wrong, maybe I was right, but anyway, I can't tell you. We also have Music of the Heart from director Wes Craven, which I saw in the theater with a big group of people. I fucking hate this movie. I love Wes Craven. I love Last House on the Left. I love The Hills Have Eyes. I even like Swamp Thing to a degree, but obviously Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream, Serpent in the Rainbow, People Under the Stairs. I'm a big fan of Wes Craven. But with this movie, he was trying to switch to more mainstream, prestigious fare. And I can remember at the time thinking how gross it was, how you have this movie about a teacher teaching classical music to her students, but whenever they would like stand for like to take a bow, or there was like the applause or the big emotional moments, they would switch to the most generic kind of like radio-friendly R&B music imaginable. It's like, well, we just heard students playing Bach and Beethoven and Mozart. Why are you contrasting that with music that feels like it would be much more of a better fit in a different kind of movie entirely? It was just a total, like, the tones are clashing, but I just thought the movie was sentimental hogwash at best. But there was a good movie on the weekend of October 29th, and that would be Being John Malkovich from director Spike Jonze. And I can remember at the time thinking that it was just so exciting that a movie that, on the surface, everything about it felt indie, off the beaten path, counterculture, like resisting the mainstream, but it was gaining mainstream acceptance. And that's why people kept writing about 1999 at the time as like this big game-changing year where whether you were a super low-budget movie like Blair Witch Project, or an independent spirit movie like this or Election, or a big budget movie like American Beauty, that suddenly just seemed like very different sensibilities and very different moods and styles in the world of filmmaking were breaking through, finding an audience, generating box office, and it just made people incredibly optimistic about film culture at that time. But also helped that Being John Malkovich was just fucking hilarious. John Cusack was great. Cameron Diaz was great. Catherine Keener was great. You want to talk about an actress who like kind of defines the late 90s. Catherine Keener, she's all over the place in this. She was in... What the hell was else? She was in... Oh, she played the wife of Nicolas Cage in 8mm, a movie I was very dismissive of earlier. But anyway, Catherine Keener was all over the place in the late 90s, and she was fantastic. And Being John Malkovich. And obviously John Malkovich was a very good sport to go along for the ride. But Spike Jonze, when he landed, it definitely felt like the arrival of a major new voice in indie cinema when he hit the scene with this flick. But before my voice dies out, let's get into our last 2 months. So starting with November... On November 5th, we have 4 movies which came out on November 5th, but a couple of them are really good, so let's just dive right in. Let's start with The Bone Collector, which I did not see because when I saw the trailer for The Bone Collector, and we would get these kind of mainstream thrillers all the time. Maybe it's almost kind of a good thing that the 90s eventually came to a close because these bland, interchangeable, like serial killer movies all went away. But there's this moment in the trailer where Denzel says, "He's laughing at us."
You are not a cop anymore.
There's a killer out there. He's laughing at us.
It was so overacted and so melodramatic that I just, anyway, I couldn't see the movie. But we also have, what the hell's her name? Angelina Jolie in one of her big starring roles of this year. But press pause on her. We still have her big one yet to come next month. But on the same weekend, we also had The Bachelor, starring Chris O'Donnell and Renee Zellweger. I've never seen it and never will. This is a remake of a movie called Seven Chances by, I've completely lost the ability to use my words, Buster Keaton, one of my favorite filmmakers from the 1920s. But a guy has to get married in order to inherit his fortune, and so women just go crazy trying to chase him down. But watch Seven Chances with Buster Keaton and skip The Bachelor like I did. But we had 2 good movies this weekend, and where I can't really say enough about them. They definitely would be on my top 10 list if I were to make a top 10 list for this year. I'll start with American Movie. Maybe my favorite documentary that I've ever seen, or definitely one of my favorite. Actually, Jodorowsky's Dune, probably my favorite documentary. But American Movie, I've seen it many times. It's brilliant. It's hilarious. It's maybe the best documentary about the making of an independent film that we will ever see. If you've ever wanted to make a big Hollywood movie or make a low-budget horror film, watch American Movie, sit back, enjoy the ride, and then watch it again and again. It's incredibly quotable. It's got great music. It's a fucking masterpiece and one of the best independent films of 1999. But on the same weekend, we also had one of Michael Mann's best movies that he ever made, The Insider. And I don't think Michael Mann has reclaimed these heights since The Insider. He's made many good movies since then, movies like Collateral, which I like quite a bit. But The Insider, this is a Hollywood prestige drama at its finest, where you've got Christopher Plummer and Al Pacino and Russell Crowe and all these really fine actors just eating each other alive with some really adversarial, confrontational material.
And Jeffrey Wigand, who's out on a limb, does he go on television and tell the truth? Yes. Is it newsworthy? Yes. Are we gonna air it? Of course not.
And I just love this shit. Like, we need more, not, I wouldn't say mean-spirited dramas, but dramas where sharp, intelligent, mature actors are allowed to really grapple and like just beat the fuck out of each other with their words in the context of a really compelling drama about current events or semi-current events that are depicted in this flick. But if you've never seen The Insider, I think this is one of Michael Mann's 5 best movies, or maybe one of his 3 best movies, but it fucking rules. But is that the end for 11/5? Yes, it is. So November 12th, we have 3 movies. Anywhere But Here with Susan Sarandon and Natalie Portman. Hard pass. I've never seen it, never will. We also have Felicia's Journey from director Adam Egoyan. And I have no idea how I missed this, because he'd had Exotica and Sweet Hereafter back to back, which made him one of the most important and beloved independent filmmakers in the world of the 1990s. If any filmmaker kind of stood for class and taste in the international scene in the late 90s, it would be Adam Egoyan. And I've totally forgotten that Felicia's Journey even existed until I started compiling some movies, or a list of these movies for this video. I was basically going through a bunch of calendars and box office reports, but I'd totally forgotten about it. You tell me if it's worth hunting down, but goddamn, Sweet Hereafter and Exotica, those are fucking great. But the most notorious film of November 12th is a movie that I hate with every fiber of my being, but we have Dogma. Back when Kevin Smith was still considered kind of controversial, counterculture, indie director, instead of just a big giant fat guy who cries while watching clips from The Flash on TV. Although now he's super skinny. He lost all the weight ever since he had his heart attack. But I will admit, in the late 90s, I was drinking the Kool-Aid on Kevin Smith. I loved Clerks, saw Clerks multiple times, and just found it incredibly inspiring that this comic book nerd in New Jersey could max out a bunch of credit cards and go out and make a pretty goddamn funny movie with next to no money. Mallrats had been less big on. Chase and Amy brought me back into the fold. And here we have Dogma. And I feel like Dogma kind of represents the full flowering of like the Miramax flavor of filmmakers transitioning into something more like an MTV flavor. And it just seemed like at a certain point, Miramax lost sight of what made Miramax, and it was kind of almost deliberately trying to become more mainstream. But this movie just feels like this weird combination of like willfully stupid juvenile humor for like a 5-year-old in terms of like shit jokes, fart jokes, boner jokes, all that stuff, while at the same time giving us incredibly pretentious conversations about faith, more often than not coming from Matt Damon and Ben Affleck.
It's dogmatic law. The church says it's so, God must adhere. This thing has a papal sanction.
Let it never be said that your anal retentive attention to detail never yielded positive results.
Now I'm starting to get sick of these guys. At this point, in the late 90s, we saw those guys a lot. But the charm of Jay and Silent Bob as a comedic duo on screen at this point was totally gone. It would be utterly evaporated and destroyed by Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back. But in Clerks, I love Jay and Silent Bob, but I fucking hated them in Dogma. But what's hilarious about this movie now is that it was considered so controversial at that time. So controversial that the Weinsteins had to personally buy the film in some weird way of like protecting it from liability or protecting Miramax and Dimension from being sued because the Catholic Church was up in arms about this movie. But when you watch it now, you're like, how is this ever considered controversial? It's like, it's so visually boring that it like borders on ugly, and it just feels sloppy and unprofessional. Just a fucking mess. Feels like it was made by just big, dumb, giant kids with too much money on their hands. So I'm not a fan of Dogma, but if you are curious, it is available for free on YouTube. Somebody uploaded it to YouTube because you cannot stream it anywhere because of the weird legal rights surrounding it. So check it out. Decide for yourself. But a few days later, we got Liberty Heights from director Barry Levinson, and this is proof that can't go home again. Barry Levinson was trying to kind of reclaim the flavor and spirit of his movie Diner from the early 80s, which put him on the map. And Diner fucking rules. Diner holds up really well. Great dialogue, great characters. And with Liberty Heights, Barry Levinson's trying to explore his childhood, and it's got a lot of, I wouldn't say heavy-handed lectures, but a lot of scenes concerning what it means to be Jewish at that time, what it meant to be interested in dating girls who might have darker skin tone and all that kind of stuff. But Adrian Brody, he's good in it. He obviously had a big year working with Barry Levinson and Spike Lee, but if you like Diner, or if you like Barry Levinson, some more of his more mainstream movies like, what the hell is it called? Once again, my brain is evaporating. Tom Cruise, Dustin Hoffman. It's going to come to me. You can watch the wheels turning. What is that movie called? Rain Man. I didn't have to look it up. It came to me. If you give me enough time, these movies come back to me. But that's what, like, Barry Levinson was huge because of movies like Rain Man. But I just think Liberty Heights is not his best work. But whatever, moving on. We have a couple movies now where they would have their premieres earlier and then come out a little later. But we have Toy Story 2 had its premiere on November 13th at the El Capitan Theater, which I've been to many times. Great theater. And then went wide on November 24th. And what's hilarious now, just seeing how much the culture has changed, that Disney felt compelled to censor their own movie before putting it on Disney Plus. They changed the ending where there's something, a joke involving the casting couch, which Disney has removed. I'm just like, Disney, go fuck yourself. It's yet another reason why Disney can burn in hell censoring movies after the fact. Just put your stupid little disclaimer on movies and then just let them play. But Toy Story at this point had become a true global phenomenon. I remember my friends in college, after I played theatrically, they would come by my room like, we're going to take mushrooms tonight. Like, can we borrow your copy of Toy Story? I'm like, yeah, but it was considered kind of cool to have a copy of Toy Story. Yeah, it just shows how different Disney was back in the late 90s. And then on November 19th, we have a couple of big releases. We have Sleepy Hollow from Tim Burton. This might be the last time that I really enjoyed a Tim Burton movie in the theater. Not all of it, but there's a scene where I think Ichabod is remembering his mom in an Iron Maiden, and I haven't seen it in 25 years, but I can remember just those eyes looking through the slit and just giving me a fucking heart attack. But I hate Tim Burton now, but in the late 80s and early 90s, or even up through like the late 90s, he was one of my favorite filmmakers alive. So this is the end of my love affair with Tim Burton. But on the same day, we got The World Is Not Enough, a Bond. I think this might be the one Bond film. Actually, this and Quantum of Solace are the only two Bond movies that I've only seen once. Oh, and No Time to Die I've only seen once. But most Bond movies I've seen over and over and over again. But I saw The World Is Not Enough in the theater. It was what it was. Denise Richards was just so beautiful. And after movies like Wild Things and Starship Troopers, I obviously was not going to skip. I wasn't going to skip any Bond movie, but having her in it, she was the perfect to be a Bond girl in terms of her look. But Sophie Marceau, who played the villain, she was much more of like a classic kind of sophisticated Bond girl. But also on the same day, because this was the late 90s, it wouldn't be a year in the late 90s without at least one adaptation of Jane Austen. And for whatever reason in the 90s, we got so many Jane Austen adaptations. But Mansfield Park, which I've not seen, but I feel like we had like 10 versions of Sense and Sensibility and all these different movies come out in the 90s. And this was definitely cashing in on the craze for Jane Austen's novels. November 24th, we have 1, 2, 3 movies. We got Todo Sobre Mi Madre, a.k.a. All About My Mother. And it had come out earlier in Europe or in Spain, but this is when it got its U.S. release. But Pedro Almodovar, this is when he really exploded. I mean, he'd had women on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and he'd had Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down. But this was one of those rare few foreign films which in the late 90s just seemed to really seize hold of the imagination of the public. Penelope Cruz was absolutely incredible in it. So yeah, it's a damn good movie. I haven't seen it in a quarter century, but I loved it at the time. But in quite a different genre, on the same day, we also have End of Days, which for me in a lot of ways was kind of the end of the early Arnold Schwarzenegger era before he drifted over into politics, became the governor. And I was living in LA when he became the governor. That was showbiz at its best. It's like having debates with Ariana Huffington, like, Ariana, the best idea, apart from you in Terminator 4. But End of Days fucking sucks. It's got one really good scene where he's screaming at Satan and saying, like, you're a choir boy, blah, blah, blah.
Oh, you want to fuck with me? You think you know bad, huh? You're a fucking choir boy compared to me. A choir boy!
But like the great heyday of Arnold was Conan and Terminator and Total Recall and Predator and True Lies. I mean, he's got so many good ones. End of Days is not one of them, so we're just going to move on to Flawless. Yet another movie from Joel Schumacher in the same year. He was still in timeout in the corner because of Batman and Robin at this point, so I did not see Flawless at that time. And then 2 days later, we have a movie which Hollywood would never dream of making today, but we have Ride with the Devil, starring Tobey Maguire and Jewel, and who else is in this? There's a whole bunch of people. Hang on. I have to whip up the IMDb because my brain is turning into guacamole. Oh, that's directed by fucking Ang Lee. Ang Lee the next year would make an even bigger name for himself with Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. But at this time, we had Skeet Ulrich, who I swore never to see in any movies ever again, but obviously I had to break my vow for this. But we also had Jonathan Rhys-Meyers and Jim Caviezel and Jeffrey Wright. And you want to talk about something you would never see, or Mark Ruffalo, something you would never see in a modern day movie where you have a black man fighting on the side of his friends in the Civil War on the South, and actually depicting the Southerners in a more kind of romantic, glamorous light. Obviously, Hollywood, when it comes to politics, is always like wrestling with the politics of the current age. But in 1999, you could still make a movie about kind of like rebel outlaws during the Civil War who basically are loyal to the Confederacy but aren't officially part of the Confederacy, which there actually were a lot of like bushwhacker groups at that time where they were fighting against the North, but they weren't officially like in uniform. But anyway, if you want to see a cool Civil War drama, check out Ride with the Devil. And alas, we come to December, and thank God, because my voice is starting to hurt. It's not just fading, it's actually starting to hurt when I talk. But we had a premiere on December 2nd of The End of the Affair, but it didn't come out until 2000, so we're going to leave out The End of the Affair. But if you like Ralph Fiennes and Julianne Moore, definitely hunt it down. December 3rd, I want to talk about another thing you would never see in Hollywood these days. We have a movie by Woody Allen, Sweet and Low Down, and I love and adore Woody Allen's filmography. Hollywood has decided that they want to blacklist him, like to each their own. He's had a nice, long, healthy career, but from the late 60s to the late 90s, Woody Allen made a lot of fantastic fucking flicks. And in the 21st century, he's got a few. I mean, like Blue Jasmine or Vicky Cristina Barcelona or Midnight in Paris. But from basically like Take the Money and Run up through Deconstructing Harry, it's like a 30-year hot streak where like he's got like 15 required viewing movies. Sweet and Low Down was the first movie I was like, you know what? Maybe the golden age of Woody is drawing to a close. Like, I love the music. It's all inspired by Django Reinhardt. And I love the performance by Samantha Morton. I believe Samantha Morton got Best Supporting Actress for this. It's not top-tier Woody. I don't think it's even second-tier Woody. But it was still a Woody Allen movie to be enjoyed. But on the same day, we got a movie by Jane Campion, Holy Smoke, starring Harvey Keitel and Kate Winslet. At this time, Jane Campion was still going real strong off of the success of The Piano, which I think is her best movie. The Piano is fucking awesome. And it won Anna Paquin an award when she was like 3. But Holy Smoke is decent. I mean, if you want to see kind of a provocative drama with a shitload of nudity, Holy Smoke is the one to see. I mean, Kate Winslet at this time was not shy one bit, but I think the Piano is the much stronger movie. And then on December 10th, we have 4 movies. Let's just start with Deuce Bigalow, Male Gigolo, because I actually went to the premiere. I can't even remember how I got the tickets to the premiere, but I went to the premiere of Deuce Bigalow. Whatever, it's this stupid Rob Reiner comment. Is it Rob Reiner or Rob Schneider? I won't look it up. A stupid Rob Schneider comedy, and there were a lot of movies like that at that time, but it just shows, once again, the health and vitality and diversity of the comedy genre at that time. But we also had The Green Mile on December 10th, adapted from Stephen King. This was a reunion between director Frank Darabont and men in prison dramas written by Stephen King. Obviously, the much better movie is Shawshank Redemption. Shawshank Redemption, one of the most beloved movies of the 1990s, even though it took a little while to kind of catch on. It failed in the theater, caught on VHS and DVD. Green Mile's good, but it's no Shawshank. And Tom Hanks is pretty good in it. And Michael Clarke Duncan was good in this as well. He basically was the only actor alive who could even play this part. But yeah, for a brief shining moment in the late 90s and early 2000s, he was in everything. I mean, he'd pop up in Armageddon. He'd pop up in friggin' Daredevil. And Michael Clarke Duncan was everywhere. And this was one of the movies where he appeared. What else came out this weekend? 12/10. We got Cradle Will Rock from director Tim Robbins. I walked out of this movie. The moment I saw how Orson Welles was being depicted in the film, I was like, you know what? We're done here. Peace. I'm out of here. Orson Welles was at that time and remains to this day my all-time favorite filmmaker. So I just cannot abide self-important, pretentious movies that murder the good name of Orson Welles. And also in this same weekend, we have what used to be kind of a Miramax specialty, where you've got an international director adapting a best-selling book all to great business. We have The Cider House Rules. You got Michael Caine. You got Tobey Maguire. You got Charlize Theron. And this is the kind of movie that Miramax used to crank out all the time, where there were just these moving prestige dramas that you had kind of a hint to be successful because they were based on best-selling books. But yeah, 2 Tobey Maguire movies inside of 2 weeks. You had this and Ride with the Devil, so pick your poison. You kind of can't go wrong with either. And then 2 days later, you had the premiere of The Talented Mr. Ripley, which would go wide on Christmas Day. But I went to see this with the whole family. It's from the director of The English Patient, Anthony Minghella, I think is how you say his name. But starred Matt Damon and Cate Blanchett and Gwyneth Paltrow and Philip Seymour Hoffman and Jude Law. And basically every sexy actor at that time or up-and-coming actor at that time. And people lost their goddamn minds over this.
Tom Ripley, Freddie March.
Tom. I mean, hey, if I'm late, think what her husband's saying.
You look gorgeous.
As always.
I'm going to recommend that people watch Purple Noon instead. It's based on the exact same book by Patricia Highsmith. And Patricia Highsmith used to write these really enticing kind of homoerotic thrillers, things like Strangers on a Train. But on December 15th, you got Mike Leigh returning with Topsy Turvy, which I've never seen. I like Secrets and Lies, his movie right before this, but Naked is the Mike Leigh movie that you have to see from the early or mid-90s. One of these days I will see Topsy Turvy, but it's just not today. And then 2 days later, we have 2 big-budget mainstream movies, both of which I skipped. Bicentennial Man. Lordy, I mean, just watch the trailer and be like, oh, yeah, I'm surprised everybody didn't skip this. But that is Robin Williams at his most nauseatingly cute and just boring. And yeah, I rewatched the trailer for Bicentennial Man last night, and I nearly threw my iPad out my window. I was like, who made this, and why have they not been put to death yet? And we also have Stuart Little, which I think Sony ended up making 2 or 3 of those, but it was a hit. I've never read nor seen any version of Stuart Little, so I'm a blank slate on that front. But on the same day, December 17th, we have a movie which technically is a 2000 movie because it went wide on January 7th, but it went into limited release on December 17th, so it does count. We have Paul Thomas Anderson's follow-up to Boogie Nights, Magnolia. And when it comes to Magnolia, I feel like everything good and bad that I've ever heard someone say about it, I kind of agree, because if you want to say that it's self-indulgent and pretentious and overly long, I agree. Or if you want to say that when it works, it soars right into the stratosphere, I agree. This is what happens when a filmmaker enjoys an unimaginable level of success at a very young age, because his film Hard Eight had kind of died and had been recut against his wishes. Then Boogie Nights was a cultural phenomenon. I mean, Boogie Nights is one of the best movies of the 1990s. I fucking love Boogie Nights. But critically and commercially did so well. So anytime a young filmmaker enjoys a lot of success, they're going to give you as much rope to hang yourself with as you could possibly imagine. And that's precisely what he did. He went off and made Magnolia. If you think it's Paul Thomas Anderson's best movie, I'm not going to argue. If you think it's his worst movie, I'm not going to argue, because I think the reality is that it's both. But this soundtrack by Amy Mann, I think I wore out my CD playing it over and over again. When you hear that song One during the opening credits, it's like the flower blooms before you. It's just Paul Thomas Anderson at his most inviting and mysterious. And there's a lot about Magnolia that I absolutely love, and I think it's aged very well. And the last movie on December 17th is Anna and the King, more Chow Yun-Fat. Chow Yun-Fat suddenly was just everywhere. And I mean, I prefer The Killer. I prefer Hard Boiled, or even before Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. I love Chow Yun-Fat. I skipped Anna and the King at the time. I'd been in the musical The King and I in high school. And same way with like Midsummer Night's Dream earlier. It's weird. In this year, we have 2 movie versions of musicals that I appeared in high school. So I felt like I'd been there, done that, bought the t-shirt. But if you want to talk about Chow Yun-Fat, yeah, watch his John Woo movies from the early 90s and late 80s. That is the Chow Yun-Fat that I know and love. But we're almost over, but we have a few more prestige releases, because remember, right before Christmas, right before New Year's, a lot of movies always get released hoping to get Oscar nominations and for like the coming in a couple months. But in this case, it worked. December 21st, Girl Interrupted, James Mangold's follow-up to Copland. And he teamed up with Winona Ryder, playing a role that she was a good 10 years too old to play. But he also teamed up with Angelina Jolie. She won the Oscar, and she basically became one of the world's biggest celebrities for the next 4, 5, 6 years. But I saw the movie for the first time in preparation for this video, and it's fascinating seeing like a young Elizabeth Moss popping up in there. And I don't know if I necessarily am in love with this movie, but there's no denying the pure, raw, emotional, just like kind of infectious energy of Angelina Jolie just sitting there with like her legs spread, chain smoking cigarettes, just talking shit to every single person in the movie. And then the shit talking continued, or like the attention grabbing moments continued with award season. Like she was always like making out with her brother and stuff like that. Or maybe she just would kiss him in kind of strange ways, but she was always dragging her brother up to like on the stage at certain award shows. Or then she'd always be like making out with Billy Bob Thornton with interviews during these like red carpet events. And they'd be like, oh yeah, like we just fucked in the car and stuff like that.
You want me to be honest with you? We in the car on the way here. Yeah.
But suddenly Angelina Jolie was everywhere. She knew how to manipulate the media to maximum advantage. And maybe Girl Interrupted was her finest hour as an actress, but she got plenty of big budget movies in the years to come right after this flick. And then on December 22nd, we got Any Given Sunday from director Oliver Stone. And in spite of having already gone on record as someone who doesn't necessarily like football, I saw this movie twice in the theater. I liked Oliver Stone quite a bit at this time. I mean, Oliver Stone in the 80s and 90s, it was very easy to be a fan. He was writing things like Scarface and directing things like Platoon and even directing things like Any Given Sunday, which is entertaining. So if you like Al Pacino and James Woods and Matthew Modine and Jamie Foxx and Cameron Diaz and Charlton Heston and all these other actors that are in there, I don't know how well it holds up. I saw it twice 25 years ago, thoroughly enjoyed it. But the other big movie on the same day, Man on the Moon from director Milos Forman, which is an attempt, and I think it was unsuccessful, at recapturing the magic of The People vs. Larry Flint, which came out a few years prior. Because you had the same writers and the same director, and that you're tackling a similar figure of controversy, but Andy Kaufman, I think James Carrey is what he was called on In Living Color, but Jim Carrey, maybe he just took it a little bit too seriously, and he's just such a different comedic performer from Andy Kaufman. And I recognize that he loved and adored and admired Andy Kaufman, but I'd rather just watch a documentary with Andy Kaufman being Andy Kaufman and just doing, like, whether you're talking about his TV work or his stand-up or his professional wrestling or all of his public antics, I just want to see Andy Kaufman do it. So I saw this once in the theater. I did my due diligence. I supported the movie, but it just felt a little bit like a laborious experience and had half the charm and half the fun of The People versus Larry Flint. But you tell me if you think I'm being too harsh on Man on the Moon. But now we finally arrived on Christmas Day with one of the funniest movies released in 1999, Galaxy Quest. Maybe the last great Star Trek movie that we will ever see. And obviously it's not a Star Trek movie. It's a movie making fun of and glorifying a similar Star Trek-like phenomenon. But Sigourney Weaver, I don't know what this movie's about, if not just like her cleavage. But Sigourney Weaver was such a good sport and just was delightful in this. And Alan Rickman and, God, what the hell's the main actor? Not Tim Robbins. Fucking Tim Allen. But the cast is incredible, and the people playing the aliens who think that these people are actual, interplanetary heroes, they just make me shriek and shit with laughter every time I watch this movie. And at the time, I skipped it in the theater. I caught up with it much later on, but it makes me laugh and laugh hard every time I watch the highlights. I think this is one of the hidden gems and one of the many reasons why 1999 was such an incredible year for the comedy genre. But on the same day, we have Titus from director Julie Taymor, starring Anthony Hopkins, short for Titus Andronicus, where I mentioned earlier in my video how I was so embarrassed that I hadn't read Taming of the Shrew before seeing that modern-day adaptation and 10 Things I Hate About You. But for a full-blown adaptation, I did read Titus Andronicus for the first time before going to see it. I went through this phase in the late 90s where I wouldn't see a Shakespeare play or movie adaptation unless I'd read it. And I think on the whole, that was a good idea. But I remember I basically got a bottle of scotch and just started sipping at it and started reading it. And I spent like the better part of an afternoon reading the play. And it's an early Shakespeare play, but it's one of his most violent and disturbing. And it involves cannibalism and murder and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, if you like seeing obscure Shakespeare adaptations from the director who would later become most famous for her musical adaptation of the Lion King animation into a theatrical production, that is who Julie Taymor is. Oh my God, I've got to wrap up this video. I've been talking almost 3 hours. I've lost the ability to talk. Play It to the Bone, also Christmas Day. It's fine. Antonio Banderas, Woody Harrelson. It's a moderately enjoyable movie, but I can kind of take it or leave it. But we also have a movie from Alan Parker. I mean, Jesus Christ, Alan Parker. He's yet another director that I should have mentioned earlier on in the video when I was listing all the great directors with movies this year. And I forgot to mention Milos Forman. I forgot to mention Oliver Stone. It just, if you compare 1999 to the present day in 2024 in terms of how many great directors were working in Hollywood simultaneously, I think there's no comparison. But Angela's Ashes, giant, prestigious, kind of awards contender. I don't like it as much as some of Alan Parker's other movies, like The Commitments. I've seen The Commitments many, many times. It is awesome. Hunt Down the Commitments, or Pink Floyd The Wall, or Midnight Express. I mean, Alan Parker's made a lot of great movies. Or, what's his Angel Heart? Killer horror movie. So yeah, Alan Parker's got a lot of great movies to his name. I don't think Angela's Ashes is in his top tier, but it was still cool seeing him get all that awards attention. And the last two movies of 1999 came out on December 29th, but we have The Hurricane from director Norman Jewison, starring Denzel Washington. I was very familiar with this story from listening to the Bob Dylan tune a billion times in college, but yeah, wrongful arrest, wrongful imprisonment. Listen to the song, and if you are not satisfied at that point, definitely watch the entire movie. But Norman Jewison, he's one of those aging legends who had started back in the 60s, but was still active and still going strong in the late 90s. And the last movie to make my list, Errol Morris's documentary, Mr. Death, The Rise and Fall of Fred A. Leuchter Jr., which I saw at the New Art. Errol Morris has made many superior movies like The Fog of War or Gates of Heaven. But this is an absolutely fascinating documentary about a guy who used to design like gas chambers and electric chairs to kill people when they're being executed. It's really grim, dark stuff. I mean, also, he was a Holocaust denier. It's been 25 years since I've seen this. So it gets into some crazy controversies as well toward the end. But yeah, he's a crazy motherfucker. And Errol Morris, arguably our greatest documentarian. If you're going to make a movie about a controversial figure who's crazy, who designs gear or designs equipment to kill people, who else but Errol Morris could do that topic justice? So there it is. This video is over. I cannot believe that I even did this. I don't know how long this video is going to be after I edit and contract and condense it, but we're at about 2 hours and 45 minutes of audio. I've never recorded this much audio for a video by myself. Whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, and whether or not that will lead to more videos of a similar nature in the future, depends upon how much people like this video. So please leave a comment below. Let me know what I got wrong. Let me know what I left out. But if you enjoyed this, if you enjoyed listening to me go hoarse right before your eyes, like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and I look forward to making a lot more videos for y'all in calendar year 2024. So thanks again for watching, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.